April 13th, 1866. The freezing gale blowing through the warped wooden slats of a small cabin in Beaver, Utah, offered a harsh welcome to the firstborn son of Maximilian Parker and Ann Gillies, a boy they named Robert LeRoy Parker. Maximilian and Ann were devout Mormon pioneers who had traveled across the plains in search of a prosperous existence. But the reality of the Utah territory provided only unending physical labor and perpetual poverty. The small wooden structure sat on a dry patch of earth where the topsoil turned to blinding, choking dust in the summer and hardened into frozen, unyielding ridges during the long winters. Inside the single cramped room, the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and unwashed wool permeated the stale air as the wind howled against the exterior walls. Anne recovered on a thin, lumpy mattress stuffed with dried grass and wrapped in coarse woolen blankets. Maximilian worked outside in the bitter temperature, chopping firewood with hands cracked and bleeding from the arid climate, desperate to keep the small hearth burning enough to keep his new son warm. The frozen wood splintered under the heavy iron axe, sending sharp shards flying into his shins as he swung repeatedly. Survival in the Beaver settlement required the entire family to toil, from the moment the sun crested the eastern mountains until complete darkness consumed the high desert valley. There was no time for rest, only a continuous cycle of survival tasks demanded by the unforgiving landscape. As Robert grew from an infant into a toddler, he did not experience a soft childhood filled with leisure or play. By the time he could walk steadily, his father handed him heavy wooden buckets to carry water from the nearby freezing creek to the house. The thick wooden handles rubbed violently against his palms, leaving his small hands raw, blistered and calloused before he reached 5 years of age. Freezing creek water often splashed over the rim of the buckets, soaking his stiff leather boots and numbing his toes to the point of severe pain. He hauled the water multiple times a day, straining his small spine under the crushing weight. The Parker family expanded rapidly, with Anne giving birth to 12 more children over the subsequent years, forcing Robert into a position of intense responsibility at an extremely young age. The small cabin grew deafeningly loud with the constant crying of hungry infants and the shuffling of numerous bodies in a confined space. Food remained consistently scarce, often consisting only of thin cornmeal mush, salted pork, and whatever dirt-covered root vegetables they could pull from the stubborn, rocky soil. Robert chewed the gritty vegetables, feeling the sand grind against his teeth, while his stomach ached from persistent malnutrition. The physical crowding in the single room meant zero privacy and a constant competition for the meager resources they managed to harvest. Robert watched his parents age rapidly under the crushing weight of their strict religious obligations and the brutal physical demands of frontier agriculture. Maximilian's posture became permanently stooped from years of pulling a plow behind stubborn draft animals, and deep, permanent lines carved into his weathered face. Anne's hair turned gray prematurely, her hands swelling at the joints from constantly washing heavy fabrics in freezing water. In 1879, seeking better grazing land and a chance to escape their mounting debts, Maximilian loaded their meager possessions into a wooden wagon and moved the family further south to a modest plot in Circleville, Utah. This region, known as Circle Valley, featured tall, dense sagebrush and jagged rock formations that formed a natural basin, trapping the intense summer heat and the bitter winter snows. The new property consisted of a small log house surrounded by completely untamed land that required grueling manual labor to clear. Before any crops could be planted, the Sevier River flowed nearby, but utilizing the water required digging deep irrigation ditches by hand through compacted clay and gravel. Robert, now 13 years old, spent his days swinging a heavy pickaxe under a blistering sun that burned the back of his neck dark red and peeling. The repeated impacts of the pickaxe sent sharp, jarring pain up his forearms and into his shoulders, building thick slabs of muscle on his teenage frame. When he wasn't digging, he swung an axe against thick juniper roots, his hands developing blisters that popped, bled, and eventually reformed into thick yellow calluses. He learned to handle frightened, kicking mules, dodging their heavy hooves while wrestling thick leather harnesses over their heads. A misplaced kick from a panicked mule could easily shatter a shin bone, requiring Robert to move with constant vigilance and quick reflexes. During these agricultural tasks, he breathed in the overwhelming acidic stench of animal sweat, urine, and manure. He worked alongside his exhausted father, hauling heavy, jagged stones from the soil to the edge of the property to build rough boundary fences. The rough stones tore at his skin and his fingernails frequently split and bled into the dirt. Despite pulling 14-hour shifts of bone-breaking labor, the family remained deeply impoverished, struggling daily to feed the massive number of children crowding the small log house. Starvation remained a constant threat, hanging over the household like a dark storm cloud. To help support his starving siblings, Robert began taking outside jobs at neighboring properties, working as a ranch hand for established wealthy cattle operations in the valley. The work proved brutally demanding, requiring him to spend 10 to 12 hours a day sitting on a hard leather saddle. He learned to ride aggressive, half-broken Mustangs, gripping the leather reins with scraped fingers as the animals bucked, twisted, and kicked violently. The terrifying force of a bucking horse threw him into the hard ground on multiple occasions, bruising his ribs and knocking the wind from his lungs. Bruised, aching, and tasting blood in his mouth, Robert would stand up, wipe the grit from his face, and climb back onto the unpredictable horse. He pushed through the severe physical pain, driven by the absolute necessity of earning his meager daily wages to buy flour for his family. During long cattle drives, he breathed in thick, choking clouds of alkaline dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves. He coughed up brown phlegm at the end of every day while eating a plate of dry, unseasoned beans beside a small, smoky campfire. The stark contrast between his grueling, painful existence and the immense wealth of the large cattle owners began to foster a deep, simmering resentment in the teenager. The wealthy cattle barons lived in large, comfortable houses in the cities, reaping massive profits while paying boys like Robert pennies to risk their lives in the dirt. While working at the Jim Marshall Ranch, Robert crossed paths with a drifter and cowhand named Mike Cassidy, a man who would permanently alter the trajectory of the young boy's life. Mike Cassidy did not possess the exhausted, beaten-down demeanor of the honest farmers and laborers in Circleville. Cassidy carried himself with a quiet, dangerous confidence, riding a horse equipped with high-quality oiled leather gear and silver spurs. He wore expensive leather boots, a clean Stetson hat, and 2 heavy Colt revolvers strapped to his waist in well-worn leather holsters. He noticed Robert's natural affinity for handling horses and began teaching the boy advanced riding techniques during their shifts together. Cassidy showed him how to read a horse's ears to anticipate sudden movements and how to shift his body weight to stay balanced during violent bucks. The older man also taught Robert the precise wrist movements required to throw a lariat with deadly accuracy. Robert spent hours practicing, throwing his rope at wooden stumps until his shoulder ached intensely, perfecting the skill until he could snag a moving target flawlessly. Robert idolized the older man, studying the way Cassidy moved, the confident way he spoke, and the way he commanded absolute respect from the other rugged ranch hands. Under Cassidy's careful tutelage, Robert learned how to draw a heavy revolver smoothly from a holster. He practiced gripping the smooth wooden handle tightly, leveling the barrel and squeezing the trigger without flinching at the loud, concussive blast of black powder. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled his nose as he learned to hit targets consistently, feeling the strong recoil travel up his arm. Mike Cassidy also introduced Robert to a hidden, highly lucrative economy operating just beneath the surface of the legitimate cattle business. This illicit enterprise functioned by altering brands and redirecting stray livestock away from the massive corporate herds. Cassidy showed the teenager how to gather dry sagebrush to build a small, smokeless campfire deep in an isolated canyon. He demonstrated how to heat a running metal rod in the hot coals until the iron tip glowed a dull, menacing orange. He then pressed the scorching tool against a captured cow's hide to transform an existing brand into a completely different, unrecognizable symbol. The sickening smell of searing animal flesh and burning hair filled the air, testing Robert's stomach during the first few attempts. The financial logic of the operation quickly overrode his physical disgust, as Cassidy explained the stark realities of the Western cattle industry. The large cattle companies own tens of thousands of cows grazing on open public land, crushing the small ranchers through sheer volume and monopolizing the limited water sources. Stealing from these massive, faceless corporations, Cassidy argued, was not a sin, but a necessary survival method for poor men in a territory controlled by wealthy, ruthless barons. The physical reality of rustling required immense skill, endurance, and a willingness to endure pain in isolated, highly dangerous environments. Robert and Mike operated deep in the rocky canyons far from the main trails, riding through dense brush that tore at their clothing and scratched their arms bloody. They worked in the pitch dark, relying solely on the faint moonlight to spot unbranded calves hiding in the thickets. They rode quietly, avoiding snapping branches that would stampede the entire herd, displaying immense stealth and control over their mounts. Spotting a target, Robert would swing his rope, feeling the heavy loop tighten securely around the calf's neck. The sudden, violent jolt on the saddle horn required him to hold on tightly as the horse maintained the tension on the rope. Dismounting rapidly, Robert would run down the line and engage in a physical wrestling match in the dust with the panicked animal. Wrestling a thrashing, kicking calf to the dirt required raw physical strength and leverage. Robert would plant his boots firmly into the loose soil, grab the animal's legs, and throw his entire body weight onto its ribcage to pin it down securely. While holding the kicking beast, dodging sharp hooves aimed at his face, Mike would apply the glowing hot iron to the flank. The calf bawled frantically in pain as the brand burned deeply into its skin, the thick, acrid smoke filling Robert's lungs. The burn left a permanent raised scar that claimed the animal for their own hidden, illicit herd. They would then drive the stolen cattle through treacherous, winding mountain passes to avoid detection by corporate range detectives. They risked fatal falls over steep cliffs, the horses slipping on loose shale, to deliver the livestock to illicit buyers waiting in hidden, remote valleys. These buyers paid in solid gold and silver coins, providing a level of rapid income Robert had never seen from his legitimate, back-breaking ranch work. The heavy weight of the coins in his pocket solidified his growing belief that honest labor only resulted in slow starvation. Robert's transition from an honest farm boy to a full-time rustler occurred through a slow erosion of his faith in the rules established by society and the church. He watched his father, Maximilian, adhere strictly to the law and the Mormon teachings, praying daily and reading the Bible by candlelight. Maximilian worked until his muscles literally failed, only to face constant threatening letters from the local bank demanding payment on the property mortgage. When Robert handed his father the heavy coins he earned from Cassidy's illicit operations, the desperate man accepted the cash without hesitation. They used the money to buy large sacks of flour, sugar, and heavy winter coats for the freezing younger children. His parents never questioned how a young, low-level ranch hand could afford to bring home so much hard currency. The deep hypocrisy of the situation formed a crystal-clear thought in Robert's young mind. Society rewarded the ruthless accumulation of wealth by the cattle barons while actively punishing honest labor with extreme poverty and starvation. This realization left cattle rustling as the only logical viable path to financial security and independence. He entirely stopped attending the long church services, preferring to spend his Sundays deep in the canyons with Mike Cassidy. He practiced his marksmanship relentlessly, spending boxes of brass ammunition shooting the heads off rattlesnakes from 20 paces away. The final, irreversible fracture between Robert and legitimate society occurred over a minor incident that escalated into a profound legal grievance. This specific event permanently solidified his deep hatred for the established law enforcement system and the unforgiving nature of proper society. One freezing winter evening, the temperature plunged rapidly, sending a biting wind slicing through Robert's thin cotton shirt. He rode into town needing a new pair of overalls and some basic food supplies, his teeth chattering from the severe cold. He arrived to find the local general store securely locked, the windows dark, and the owner completely absent from the premises. The street sat completely empty with no one around to unlock the doors or conduct a simple business transaction. Freezing, exhausted, and needing the supplies for his family, Robert made a swift, fateful decision. He found a heavy rock and smashed a glass window pane, the loud sound shattering the quiet night air. Reaching through the jagged glass shards, careful not to slice his wrist, he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell of dry goods, leather, and spices filled his nose as he walked behind the wooden counter. He took a durable pair of denim jeans and a large, freshly baked blueberry pie from the display case. Finding a piece of paper and a pencil stub on the counter, he wrote a clear, promissory note. He detailed the items taken, promised to pay for them upon his return, and signed his actual name, Robert LeRoy Parker. Believing his written word and signature carried honest weight in his own hometown, he left the paper squarely on the cash register and departed. Instead of accepting the signed note as an honest guarantee from a local farm boy, the angry store owner immediately contacted the authorities. A stern local deputy arrived at the Parker farm the very next day to execute a formal arrest. The public humiliation burned deeply as the lawman clamped cold steel handcuffs securely around Robert's wrists in front of his weeping mother. The tight grip of the deputy forced him onto a horse, dragging him through the center of town to the county jail. The experience of being locked inside a small, damp cell triggered a profound, violent rage within the teenager. The heavy iron door slammed shut and the sliding metal bolt locked him inside a tiny, claustrophobic space. The stagnant air inside the cell smelled strongly of urine, vomit, and the despair of previous occupants. The heavy iron bars and the solid wooden door represented a complete, terrifying loss of physical freedom. It was a state of forced confinement that Robert found physically unbearable and deeply, permanently humiliating. He paced the small floor, feeling like a trapped wild animal, swearing he would never allow another man to lock him in a cage. When the case finally went before the local judge, Robert stood tall and argued his defense clearly. He stated that he had left a signed note and fully intended to pay his debt, presenting the paper as hard evidence. The judge reviewed the note and ultimately accepted the defense, resulting in a full legal acquittal and his release from custody. However, the damage to his reputation in the small, strictly religious community of Circleville proved entirely permanent and completely irreversible. The local shopkeepers viewed him with open suspicion, whispering behind his back when he walked down the dirt streets. Mothers pulled their children away when he passed, and the local sheriff watched his daily movements with constant, glaring scrutiny. The unbearable social pressure extended to his family, who suffered the heavy stigma of harboring a known, arrested thief in their home. Realizing that his continued presence in Circle Valley would only bring further harassment to his exhausted parents and siblings, Robert made a difficult choice. He decided to leave his home permanently, severing ties with the legitimate world that had offered him nothing but pain and humiliation. He packed his few essential belongings into 2 durable canvas saddlebags, preparing for a life on the open trail. These supplies included a heavy woolen blanket, several boxes of brass ammunition, and a reliable Winchester rifle he had purchased with his rustling profits. He cleaned and oiled the rifle meticulously, knowing his life would soon depend on its flawless mechanical operation. He stood in the dry dirt yard of the Parker cabin, hugging his weeping mother, feeling her tears soak through his shirt. He shook hands with his silent, defeated father, feeling the rough calluses on the older man's tired hands one last time. He knew he could never return to this life of impoverished obedience and crushing, endless labor. Mounting his strong horse, he gripped the leather reins and spurred the animal forward with determination. The dust rose behind the hooves as he rode away from the only home he had ever known, leaving the valley behind. He headed toward the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open frontier, committing fully to the dangerous path ahead. Robert LeRoy Parker rode toward the outlaw trails of the Southwest, ready to fully embrace the criminal teachings of his mentor and forge a new, formidable identity in the violent landscape of the American West. June 24th, 1889. Telluride, Colorado sat nestled within a steep box canyon surrounded by the towering, jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains. The high-altitude air held a chill as the morning sun slowly crept down the rocky, pine-covered slopes, illuminating the bustling mining camp. Black smoke billowed from the brick chimneys of ore processing mills, carrying the acrid stench of sulfur and burning coal through the muddy streets. Loaded wooden wagons churned the thoroughfare into a brown sludge. The settlement pulsed with industrial effort, drawing vast wealth from the subterranean veins of the surrounding earth. The sheer volume of gold and silver extracted from the nearby smuggler union. And tomboy mines required a robust financial institution to handle massive daily payrolls and ore exchanges. The San Miguel Valley Bank occupied a prime location on the main street, its brick facade projecting an image of impenetrable security. Inside, tellers stood behind wooden counters topped with ornate brass grills, counting stacks of paper currency and weighing gold nuggets on precise scales. The constant clinking of coins echoing off polished floorboards served as a permanent temptation to anyone willing to risk their life for immense prosperity. The young man who arrived in Telluride to claim this wealth no longer identified himself as a struggling laborer from the Utah Territory. During the intervening years, he traveled north to Rock Springs, Wyoming, securing employment in a local butcher shop, cutting slabs of beef and pork. Swinging cleavers through bone and muscle, he earned the local moniker Butch. To further obscure his identity and protect his distant family from unwanted law enforcement scrutiny, he adopted the surname of his former rustling mentor. He was now Butch Cassidy. Cassidy did not arrive in the crowded mining town alone. He rode alongside Matt Warner and Tom McCarty, 2 experienced thieves familiar with the lethal realities of frontier robbery. Warner possessed a stocky, muscular build and an aggressive temperament, carrying a Winchester rifle and 2 revolvers. McCarty brought extensive tactical knowledge, understanding the crucial importance of planning, timing, and crowd control during a high-stakes heist. Together, the trio formed an efficient, tightly disciplined unit, determined to execute a precise, bloodless extraction of the bank's deep reserves. For several days prior to the assault, the 3 men camped just outside the city limits, meticulously studying the daily rhythms and vulnerable routines of the target institution. They observed armed guards delivering canvas sacks of cash, noting hours when the bank held the maximum amount of currency. Cassidy mapped the surrounding terrain, identifying the fastest, most concealed exit routes out of the steep canyon and into the rugged wilderness beyond. The operation relied on precision. They needed to strike swiftly, secure the funds, and vanish before the armed local populace could mount a lethal response. The core strategy depended on an advanced relay system of high-endurance horses strategically positioned along their planned escape route. They spent a portion of their available capital purchasing the strongest, fastest thoroughbreds they could acquire, animals bred for deep stamina and explosive speed. They hid these mounts in secluded ravines located 20 and 40 miles outside of Telluride, securing them with adequate water and rich grain. This logistical advantage ensured that while pursuing posses would slowly exhaust their single set of horses, the robbers would constantly switch to fresh, powerful animals, easily outpacing their pursuers. On the morning of the operation, the trio rode into Telluride at a casual pace, blending in with the flow of miners, teamsters, and merchants crowding the streets. The temperature remained cool, allowing them to wear long canvas dusters that effectively concealed the multiple firearms strapped to their waists and shoulders. They guided their horses through the deep mud, the animals' hooves making sucking noises with every step. Stopping directly in front of the brick facade of the bank, they dismounted with practiced synchronization, their boots splashing onto the wooden boardwalk. McCarty remained outside, casually leaning against a wooden hitching post while holding the leather reins of all three horses. He kept his right hand resting mere inches from the exposed grip of his revolver, his eyes constantly moving, monitoring the foot traffic passing in front of the building. His primary responsibility was securing the perimeter and ensuring their means of escape remained unobstructed, ready to provide suppressive fire if the situation deteriorated. Cassidy and Warner turned toward the heavy glass doors, pulling their hat brims low over their eyes to obscure their facial features. Pushing through the entrance, Cassidy and Warner stepped onto the polished floorboards, the interior smelling strongly of fresh ink, cigar smoke, and oiled wood. The bank manager and a single teller stood behind the brass-grilled counter, sorting through a large stack of paper currency, entirely unaware of the lethal threat entering their workspace. Cassidy moved swiftly to the left, positioning himself near the main window to maintain a clear line of sight to the street, while Warner walked aggressively toward the center teller station. In a fluid motion, both men swept their long coats back and drew their revolvers. The metallic click of the revolver hammers pulling back echoed harshly through the quiet room, shattering the peaceful atmosphere of the business day. Warner leveled his weapon directly at the center of the teller's chest, his finger resting firmly on the trigger, his voice barking a harsh, terrifying command to freeze and raise their hands. The teller gasped, his face draining of all color, his hands trembling violently as he slowly raised them toward the high ceiling. The bank manager froze completely, his eyes locked onto the hollow bore of Cassidy's weapon aimed directly at his face. There was no negotiation, only the undeniable threat of lethal force dictating the actions of everyone inside the room. Cassidy ordered the manager to unlock the waist-high wooden gate separating the public lobby from the secure employee area. His voice cold, steady, and devoid of panic. The manager fumbled with the iron key, his hands shaking so much he dropped it onto the floorboards twice before successfully turning the lock. Warner pushed through the open gate, his boots stomping loudly, closing the distance between himself and the terrified bank employees. Warner shoved the barrel of his revolver hard against the teller's jawbone, the steel pressing into the man's flesh, demanding access to the main vault and the cash drawers. Sweat poured down the teller's forehead, stinging his eyes as he stammered, frantically opening the wooden drawers and revealing tightly bound stacks of greenbacks. Cassidy moved behind the counter, unrolling a canvas sack he had concealed beneath his long duster, spreading it open on the smooth mahogany surface. He began sweeping the bundles of paper money into the bag, the dry sound filling the room. The robbers did not stop at the loose paper currency. They demanded the bags of gold and silver coins stored in the rear safe. The manager, terrified of the aggressive armed men, complied without resistance, dragging 4 sacks from the iron safe and placing them onto the floor. The weight of the precious metals required Cassidy and Warner to lift them with both hands, straining their shoulder muscles as they dropped the loads into their collection bags. The combined haul totaled roughly $20,000, a staggering, life-altering fortune. Outside on the boardwalk, McCarty maintained his vigilant watch, noticing a local citizen stopping to peer curiously through the large plate glass window. McCarty stepped forward, his hand gripping his weapon tightly, glaring fiercely at the bystander until the man nervously averted his eyes and continued walking rapidly down the muddy street. Inside, Cassidy tied a thick leather knot around the top of the bulging canvas sack, securing the fortune, his heart pounding a steady rhythm in his chest. They backed away from the counter slowly, keeping their weapons trained squarely on the terrified employees. Backing through the front doors, Cassidy and Warner spilled out onto the wooden boardwalk, the sacks of stolen currency pulling hard against their shoulders. McCarty already had the horses untied and repositioned for a rapid mount, the animals sensing the escalating tension, shifting their weight nervously and tossing their heads. The trio secured the bags to the leather saddle horns, tying them down tightly with thick rawhide straps to prevent the weight from unbalancing their mounts. They swung their bodies into the saddles simultaneously, digging their spurs harshly into the horses' flanks. As the horses surged forward, their iron shoes kicking up large, wet clods of mud, a panicked scream erupted from the interior of the bank. The teller burst through the front doors, pointing wildly at the fleeing riders, screaming at the top of his lungs that the institution had just been emptied. Townspeople froze in confusion for a second before the reality of the situation registered, prompting merchants to drop their goods and sprint toward their homes to retrieve their firearms. The quiet morning shattered as men shouted orders and dogs barked frantically. Several armed citizens rushed onto the street, raising rifles and revolvers, firing blindly toward the retreating outlaws through the smoky air. Hot chunks of metal sliced through the space around Cassidy, one passing dangerously close to his ear with a cracking sound, but the distance grew too rapidly for accurate marksmanship. The trio ignored the chaotic gunfire, keeping their heads low against their horses' manes, urging the powerful animals to maximum velocity as they reached the edge of the town limits. They veered sharply onto a narrow trail stretching directly up into the mountains. The incline forced the horses to work incredibly hard, their chest muscles flexing and straining against the leather harnesses, their breathing transforming into harsh, rasping gasps. Cassidy checked his back trail, watching the town of Telluride shrink into a chaotic cluster of tiny wooden boxes far below them in the deep canyon. The sound of a rapidly forming posse drifted up the mountain, the echoes of shouting men and barking hounds signaling the beginning of a relentless pursuit. The outlaws pushed their mounts to the edge of their physical endurance. The miles of the escape route tested the physical limits of both the riders and the animals. Navigating treacherous, loose shale fields where a single misstep meant a fatal plunge. Branches tore at their dusters and scratched their faces, drawing thin lines of bright red blood that mixed with the alkaline dust coating their skin. The altitude thinned the air severely, causing the horses' nostrils to flare wide as they desperately sucked in oxygen, white foam building thick around their metal bits. Sweat poured off the animals in constant sheets. Reaching the hidden relay station tucked deep within a dense grove of aspen trees, the trio executed a flawless practice transfer. They leaped from their exhausted, heaving mounts, rapidly unbuckling the leather cinch straps and pulling the saddles, along with the bulging bags of currency, off their backs. They threw the gear onto the backs of 3 fresh, energized horses that had been resting and feeding for days in anticipation of this precise moment. Within 2 minutes, they were back in the saddle, spurring the fresh thoroughbreds forward with explosive speed. Far behind them, The Telluride posse pushed their own horses up the grueling mountain trail, carrying rifles and a burning desire to reclaim the stolen wealth. The lawmen rode hard, tracking the deep-churned hoofprints left by the fleeing robbers, believing they would eventually run the outlaws' horses into the ground through sheer attrition. However, when the exhausted posse finally reached the aspen grove, they found only the abandoned sweat-soaked horses left behind by the criminals. The realization hit the local sheriff. They were chasing men utilizing a well-funded relay system. By midday, the biting cold of the mountain morning vanished, replaced by a blistering sun that baked the high desert plateaus of western Colorado. Cassidy, Warner, and McCarty rode relentlessly, transitioning from the jagged alpine peaks down into the dry, arid canyons stretching toward the Utah border. The fresh horses devoured the harsh terrain, their long, powerful strides eating up the miles, widening the gap between the outlaws and any potential pursuit to an insurmountable distance. The physical toll on the men grew severe, their thighs chafed raw against the stiff leather saddles. They drank sparingly from their canteens, the warm, metallic-tasting water offering minimal relief from the dust caking their mouths and throats. They did not stop to eat or rest, maintaining a punishing pace throughout the entire afternoon, driven by the fortune secured tightly to their saddle horns. The landscape around them transformed into an alien environment of towering red sandstone spires and deep, labyrinthine canyons offering thousands of perfect hiding spots. They were entering a desolate expanse known only to hardened criminals, rustlers, and those desperately fleeing the reach of civilized justice. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, casting dark purple shadows across the desert floor, they finally slowed their pace to a walk. They navigated their mounts into a deep, secluded slot canyon, the towering rock walls providing concealment from anyone searching the open plains above. Dismounting on shaking, exhausted legs, they untied the canvas sacks, the weight dropping onto the sandy canyon floor with a deeply satisfying thud. They built a smokeless fire using dry cottonwood branches, preparing to examine the results of their operation. Sitting cross-legged in the dirt, they untied the thick leather cords and spilled the contents of the bags onto a woolen blanket. Bundles of paper currency, bearing the marks of various national banks, tumbled out alongside solid stacks of gold and silver coins. The sheer magnitude of the stolen wealth lay displayed before them, a staggering sum of $20,000, an amount a common laborer could not earn in 20 lifetimes of toil. The men divided the haul into 3 perfectly equal shares, counting the stacks by firelight. For Cassidy, staring at the pile of currency, the Telluride robbery represented a permanent, irreversible crossing of a profound threshold. The small-time cattle operations of his youth were entirely in the past, replaced by high-stakes armed assaults against financial institutions. He had successfully orchestrated and executed a complex, lucrative crime against a fortified bank in broad daylight, outsmarting the local authorities and escaping unharmed. The strategic use of relay horses, detailed reconnaissance, and disciplined, bloodless execution proved his theories of organized theft were not just viable but immensely profitable. He packed his share of the fortune into a secure leather roll, feeling the dense weight of the paper and gold against his palms. The money provided financial freedom, allowing him to purchase the finest horses, highest quality firearms, and secure safe havens anywhere in the sprawling American West. However, the success also guaranteed his face and name would become the primary target of every aggressive lawman, bounty hunter, and corporate detective agency operating in the country. The San Miguel Valley bank robbery firmly established his uncompromising reputation across the frontier. The trio spent the night deep in the hidden canyon, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept the heavy sleep of severe physical exhaustion. The desert wind howled through the narrow rock walls above them, a lonely sound that served as the only background noise in the vast, empty wilderness. They awoke before dawn, saddling their horses in the freezing dark, preparing to scatter in different directions to complicate any remaining pursuit efforts by the authorities. Warner and McCarty shook hands with their partner, mounting their horses and riding away into the gray light. Cassidy rode alone, heading deeper into the isolated, treacherous region of southeastern Utah, an area known for harboring fugitives, soon to become his central sanctuary. The heavily laden saddlebags thumped reassuringly against his horse's flanks, a tangible reminder of the successful actions he had committed the previous morning. He navigated the winding, dry riverbeds and towering rock formations with expert precision, leaving no tracks on the hard stone surfaces, effectively vanishing from the face of the earth. He rode further into the shadows, a wealthy man untethered from society. The transition was final. The destitute laborer no longer existed. The Telluride heist proved his capability to plan, organize, and execute high-level criminal operations, completely separating him from the petty thieves who filled territorial jails. Armed with thousands of dollars, a lethal reputation, and a deep understanding of the vast, untamed geography, he fully embraced the outlaw lifestyle. Butch Cassidy had arrived, and the sprawling, wealthy corporations of the West now faced an intelligent, meticulously organized, and relentlessly driven adversary ready to strike again. July 10th, 1894. The stifling heat inside the Fremont County Courthouse in Lander, Wyoming, pressed down on the spectators crowding the wooden benches. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of sunlight piercing the tall, unwashed windows, illuminating the austere wooden podium where Judge Jesse Knight presided. Cassidy sat quietly at the defense table, his hands resting on the scarred oak surface, projecting a calm demeanor despite the severe reality of his current situation. He had been convicted 10 days earlier of grand larceny involving the theft of a horse, the second prosecution that had finally allowed the persistent Wyoming livestock authorities to secure a firm grip on the elusive outlaw. The local Cattlemen's Association had driven a relentless prosecution determined to remove a known threat from their grazing territories. The second trial opened on June 30th, and the attorneys utilized every available legal mechanism to corner their target. Cassidy listened intently as the prosecuting attorney delivered a blistering argument, pacing back and forth across the creaking floorboards while pointing an accusatory finger. The jury found Cassidy guilty while acquitting his ranch partner, leaving Judge Knight to determine the punishment that now awaited the convicted rustler. Judge Knight adjusted his spectacles and stared down from the elevated bench, reading the official sentencing document with a stern, booming voice that echoed off the plaster walls. He condemned Cassidy to serve 2 full years of hard labor behind the high stone walls of the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Laramie. The finality of the gavel striking the wooden block signaled the abrupt end of Cassidy's unfettered movement across the sprawling western frontier. Fremont County deputies stepped forward, gripping Cassidy firmly by the bicep and pulling him up from the wooden chair to begin the long journey to the state prison. The physical transition into state custody began with the application of dense steel restraints, a harsh sensory shock to a man accustomed to limitless freedom. A deputy clamped cold iron shackles around Cassidy's wrists and ankles, securing the mechanism with a thick padlock that clicked shut with a hollow metallic thud. The chain connecting his legs restricted his stride to a slow, humiliating shuffle, forcing him to take shortened, awkward steps down the courthouse stairs. A small crowd of onlookers gathered on the dirt street, whispering and pointing at the notorious cattle rustler as deputies loaded him into the back of a waiting transport wagon. The arduous journey to Laramie involved a long, uncomfortable ride aboard a Union Pacific passenger train, surrounded by armed guards holding loaded shotguns. Cassidy sat near a smudged glass window, the iron cuffs biting into his wrists every time the rail car jolted over uneven tracks. He watched the vast open plains of central Wyoming roll past, observing the distant snow-capped peaks and the expansive sagebrush flats he used to navigate with total impunity. The rhythmic clacking of the steel wheels against the rails served as a constant mocking reminder of the sprawling landscape he was rapidly leaving behind. Arriving in Laramie, the sheer scale and imposing architecture of the state penitentiary loomed ominously on the outskirts of the town. The facility featured towering gray stone walls topped with armed guard towers, projecting an aura of absolute, inescapable containment designed to break the human spirit. The stout iron entrance gates swung open with a deafening screech of ungreased hinges, swallowing the transport wagon into a dark, enclosed courtyard. Armed guards surrounded the vehicle, barking harsh commands and aiming Winchester rifles directly at the prisoners as they slowly descended to the cobblestone ground. The intake process at the penitentiary operated as a systematic method to strip away individual identity and instill total obedience to the warden's strict authority. Guards marched Cassidy into a damp, windowless processing room, ordering him to remove his civilian clothing and surrender all personal possessions. He stood naked on a freezing concrete floor while attendants threw buckets of icy water over his torso, vigorously scrubbing his skin with caustic lye soap that burned his flesh. The attendants shaved his head bald using dull, straight razors, leaving his scalp raw, red, and exceptionally sensitive to the frigid drafts circulating through the stone corridors. Following the aggressive cleansing, officials issued Cassidy a coarse, ill-fitting uniform consisting of pants and a jacket covered in bold, horizontal black and white stripes. The stiff canvas material chafed uncomfortably against his bare skin, lacking any insulation against the perpetual chill radiating from the thick masonry walls. They assigned him a specific numerical designation, formally erasing the name Robert LeRoy Parker and the alias Butch Cassidy from the prison's daily vocabulary. Inmate number 187 now stood in line with dozens of other convicts, shuffling silently toward the main cell block under the watchful, hostile gaze of the correctional officers. The primary cell block consisted of multiple tiers of cramped, iron-barred cages stacked precariously upon one another, connected by narrow metal catwalks and steep staircases. The ambient noise inside the cavernous hall created a deafening, chaotic cacophony of clanging metal, coughing inmates and the booming voices of guards shouting orders. Cassidy stepped inside his assigned cell, a tiny rectangular space measuring barely 5 feet wide by 8 feet long, devoid of any natural light or fresh air. The ponderous barred door slid shut with a terrifying, definitive crash, the complex locking mechanism engaging with a loud mechanical clunk that signaled total isolation. The interior of the cell offered only the most basic, punishing amenities. A thin canvas cot suspended from the wall by chains, a filthy woolen blanket, and a small metal bucket serving as a toilet. The air smelled strongly of rust, stale sweat, and human waste, creating a permanent foul odor that clung to the striped uniforms and the damp walls. Nighttime brought no relief from the oppressive environment. The guards kept dim gas lanterns burning constantly in the corridors, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone floors. Sleep proved nearly impossible during the first few weeks as Cassidy lay awake listening to the desperate moans and frantic pacing of the men confined in the adjacent cages. The warden enforced an unyielding daily routine designed to maximize industrial output, while simultaneously crushing any rebellious tendencies among the incarcerated population. A jarring brass bell shattered the silence at 5 in the morning, forcing the inmates to stand at rigid attention beside their cots for the morning head count. They marched in a tight single-file line to the immense dining hall, instructed to maintain absolute silence under the threat of severe physical punishment for uttering a single syllable. Breakfast consisted of watery oatmeal and a chunk of hard, stale bread, consumed rapidly while staring blankly at the back of the striped shirt belonging to the man seated directly ahead. The primary function of the Wyoming State Penitentiary involved extracting hard manual labor from the convicts, generating revenue for the state through various industrial operations. Cassidy found himself assigned to the prison broom factory, a sprawling, poorly ventilated warehouse filled with choking dust and the constant deafening roar of crude machinery. He spent 10 grueling hours a day standing at a wooden workbench, manually binding stiff straw to wooden handles with tight, coarse twine. The repetitive, monotonous motions caused his hands to cramp fiercely, the rough twine cutting deep grooves into his fingers and leaving his skin raw and bleeding. Other days required exhausting shifts in the nearby stone quarry, where inmates swung dense sledgehammers to fracture enormous limestone boulders under a blistering, unforgiving sun. Cassidy felt the jarring impact travel up the wooden handle and into his forearms with every strike, his muscles burning and aching from the relentless, punishing exertion. Guards stood perched on elevated wooden platforms holding loaded rifles, watching intently for any sign of slacking or unauthorized communication among the desperate laborers. The physical toll proved severe, stripping away his excess weight and replacing it with lean, hardened muscle born from continuous brutal struggle against unyielding rock. During the brief, heavily monitored recreation periods in the dirt yard, Cassidy quietly observed the intricate social hierarchies and brutal dynamics governing the prison population. He interacted with a diverse array of hardened criminals, including train robbers, murderers, and professional swindlers, listening carefully to their stories of failure and capture. He quickly identified a common theme among the incarcerated men. Their downfalls resulted from poor planning, excessive alcohol consumption, and placing trust in unreliable, undisciplined accomplices. The penitentiary served as a grim educational academy, providing Cassidy with a masterclass in the fatal flaws that ultimately destroyed disorganized criminal enterprises. These daily observations sparked a profound shift in Cassidy's approach to his illicit profession, transforming him from a reactive outlaw into a meticulous, forward-thinking strategist. He realized that relying on impromptu decisions and amateur partners guaranteed a quick return to the miseries of a damp, iron cell. Successful operations required the implementation of strict military discipline, extensive advanced scouting, and a network of highly loyal, specialized professionals capable of executing complex maneuvers flawlessly. He began mentally drafting the foundational blueprints for a new, immensely organized syndicate, vowing to control every variable and eliminate the sloppy mistakes that plagued standard frontier outlaws. The psychological strain of confinement tested Cassidy's sanity, pushing his mind to the absolute limit as the long, dreary months stretched into a seemingly endless void. The lack of open horizons, the absence of fresh wind, and the constant claustrophobic pressure of the stone walls induced severe bouts of restless agitation. He paced the narrow length of his cell for hours, his leather boots wearing a visible path into the concrete floor, his mind racing with detailed plans for future heists. He channeled his mounting frustration into a cold, calculated focus, determined to use his current suffering as fuel for building an unstoppable, highly lucrative criminal empire upon his release. Winter arrived in Laramie with devastating ferocity, plunging the temperatures inside the unheated cell blocks well below freezing for weeks at a time. Frost accumulated thick on the iron bars, and the stone walls radiated a bone-chilling cold that pierced through the thin striped canvas uniforms. Cassidy wrapped himself tightly in his single threadbare blanket, shivering violently on the suspended cot, struggling to maintain his core temperature during the long, agonizing nights. The severe cold weakened the inmates' immune systems, causing rampant outbreaks of influenza and pneumonia that swept through the crowded tiers with lethal speed. The sound of fierce, hacking coughs echoed constantly through the hall, followed frequently by the grim sight of guards carrying lifeless bodies out on canvas stretchers. Cassidy focused entirely on basic survival, conserving his energy, eating every scrap of the foul prison rations, and maintaining a strict regimen of physical exercises within the confined space of his cage. He performed hundreds of push-ups against the freezing floor, keeping his muscles dense and his cardiovascular system robust despite the atrocious, unsanitary living conditions. This rigorous physical discipline shielded him from the diseases ravaging the weaker inmates, ensuring his body remained strong enough to endure the brutal environment. The guards employed various methods of psychological torment, frequently conducting unannounced aggressive searches of the cells, tossing the meager belongings of the inmates onto the walkways. They sought hidden contraband, utilizing these raids to assert dominance and remind the prisoners of their total lack of privacy and personal agency. Cassidy learned to remain completely stoic during these intrusive events, staring straight ahead with blank, unreadable eyes, refusing to grant the guards the satisfaction of seeing him angry or humiliated. He locked his emotions away behind an impenetrable mental fortress, projecting an aura of quiet compliance while his internal resolve grew harder than the surrounding masonry. The isolation also provided ample time to analyze the geographical layout of the Western Territories, plotting a vast network of secure, unreachable sanctuaries. Cassidy envisioned utilizing remote, exceptionally defensible locations like the Hole-in-the-Wall Valley in central Wyoming and Browns Park along the Utah-Colorado border as primary operational bases. These rugged, isolated regions offered natural fortresses surrounded by sheer cliffs and easily monitored choke points, making them virtually impregnable to large mounted posses or federal marshals. He mentally mapped the fastest escape routes, the hidden water sources, and the strategic supply caches necessary to sustain a fugitive army operating across 3 states. As his sentence progressed, Cassidy maintained a flawless disciplinary record, understanding that good behavior offered the fastest, most reliable path back to the open frontier. He followed every command without hesitation, completed his grueling factory quotas flawlessly, and avoided all the bloody conflicts that frequently erupted between rival inmate factions in the yard. The warden and the guards eventually categorized him as a model prisoner, a quiet, industrious man who caused no trouble and posed zero threat to the established institutional order. This carefully cultivated facade of rehabilitation masked the highly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous criminal architect developing rapidly beneath the surface. The opportunity for early release materialized during the harsh winter of 1896, sparked by his strong behavioral record and a forceful appeal from the judge who had sentenced him. Judge Jesse Knight, troubled by what he considered procedural mistakes and impressed by Cassidy's conduct, had written Governor William Alford Richards the previous September requesting a pardon. The appeal carried endorsements from a remarkable collection of local officials, including sheriffs, deputies, municipal officers, and political figures from Fremont County. Their combined pressure slowly gained traction, moving Cassidy's file to the top of the executive review stack. In January, the warden summoned Cassidy from the noisy broom factory to the quiet, wood-paneled administrative office located near the front entrance of the facility. The sudden transition from the dusty, deafening work floor to the clean, comfortable office felt jarring, the smell of cigar smoke and polished mahogany contrasting sharply with the stench of the cell blocks. The warden sat behind a massive desk, holding an official wax-sealed document bearing the signature of the Wyoming governor and the formal seal of the state. He informed the prisoner that the governor was prepared to offer a full pardon, contingent upon one highly specific, non-negotiable condition. The state required a solemn, binding promise from Cassidy that he would never again commit a criminal offense within the geographical borders of Wyoming. The authorities wanted to export their problem, effectively banishing the notorious rustler to neighboring territories in exchange for his swift freedom from the stone fortress. Cassidy listened to the terms with a calm, unreadable expression, calculating the vast opportunities awaiting him in Utah, Colorado, and Nevada, areas perfectly suited for his ambitious new strategies. Without hesitation, he agreed to the governor's stipulation, verbally pledging to leave the cattle and the banks of Wyoming entirely unmolested. The warden presented the official pardon document, and a steel-nibbed pen dipped in dark black ink, gesturing toward the designated signature line at the bottom of the parchment. Cassidy grasped the pen, his hand steady and firm, and signed his legal name, Robert LeRoy Parker, binding himself to the agreement with the state government. The stroke of the pen legally erased the remaining portion of his sentence, transforming him instantly from inmate number 187 back into a free, autonomous citizen. The psychological weight of the impending release washed over him, a powerful surge of anticipation replacing the dull, grinding despair of the previous 18 months. The final night in the cell block felt excruciatingly long, the ambient noises of the prison amplifying in his ears as he lay awake on the hard canvas cot. He stared at the ceiling, mentally organizing the geographical details, personal contacts, and operational lessons he had accumulated during his lengthy confinement. The penitentiary had intended to break him, to crush his spirit and force him into a life of compliant servitude. But it had instead given him months to study the errors that repeatedly placed careless criminals behind bars. He sorted the names, routes, and weaknesses into a private inventory he intended to test once the gates opened. The following morning, the guards escorted Cassidy to the processing room for the final time, instructing him to remove the hated striped uniform. They handed him a pile of civilian clothing, including a pair of sturdy denim trousers, a thick woolen shirt, and a wide-brimmed felt hat. The sensation of rough, durable fabric against his skin, unburdened by the stigma of the prison stripes, brought a profound sense of restored dignity and personal agency. They returned his personal effects, placing a small stack of coins and his pocket watch onto the wooden table, the final items needed to facilitate his exit. Dressed in his civilian attire, Cassidy walked down the long, echoing corridor toward the front entrance, the heavy boots sounding different, lighter, without the dragging weight of the iron chains. The warden met him at the main gate, offering a stern, final warning to honor his agreement and stay far away from the Wyoming border. Cassidy nodded politely, securing his hat firmly on his head, his face displaying a calm, respectful demeanor that utterly masked his fierce, underlying ambition. He waited patiently as the guard turned the massive iron key in the lock, the heavy bolts sliding back with a loud, satisfying mechanical clatter. The stout steel doors swung outward, revealing the bright, blinding sunlight and the sprawling, snow-covered landscape stretching toward the distant horizon. Cassidy stepped across the threshold, taking his first unhindered breath of crisp, frigid winter air, the scent of pine and sagebrush filling his lungs, completely free from the stench of the cell block. He stood in the dirt road outside the prison walls, a free man whose patience and observational discipline had been sharpened by months of severe hardship. The authorities believed they had successfully corrected a minor rustler, unaware of how carefully he had studied every failure that brought the other prisoners into their custody. He turned away from the towering stone walls of the Laramie Penitentiary, pulling the collar of his woolen coat up against the biting wind, and began walking toward the rail station. He did not look back at the facility, his entire focus directed forward, aiming toward the hidden canyons and the sprawling deserts where he would implement his grand, illicit designs. The isolated, disorganized thief who entered the prison no longer existed, replaced by a highly disciplined visionary leader ready to assemble a crew of specialized professionals. The era of the lone frontier bandit was officially over, and the reign of the meticulously planned outlaw syndicate stood poised to commence. April 21st, 1897. A pervasive layer of black coal dust coated every wooden structure, glass window, and dirt road in the bustling mining town of Castle Gate, Utah. The settlement existed solely to extract fuel from the surrounding canyon walls, a bleak industrial hub dominated by the sprawling operations of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company. Men emerged from the subterranean shafts with their faces painted black by soot, coughing up dark phlegm into the gutters as they trudged toward the company store. The air smelled of sulfur, burning wood, and unwashed bodies hanging stagnant in the narrow gorge carved by the Price River. This environment offered no comfort, only grueling manual labor compensated by eagerly anticipated semi-monthly wages. The lifeblood of this harsh economy arrived via the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, carrying the hard currency required to pay hundreds of desperate miners. These men possessed short tempers and a constant need for their earnings to feed large families living in flimsy wooden shacks dotting the rocky hillsides. Any disruption to the payroll delivery threatened to spark widespread violent unrest among the armed, exhausted workforce. Therefore, the company arranged for sacks of silver coin to travel under guard from Salt Lake City down to the remote outpost. The logistics of moving such concentrated wealth through isolated territory presented a glaring vulnerability to anyone possessing the necessary tactical insight. Robert LeRoy Parker, operating under his established alias, sat on a sturdy bay horse near the stone mercantile building, watching the steel tracks with cold, calculated focus. Beside him sat Elsie Lay, a tall, slender, exceptionally intelligent outlaw who shared his vision for bloodless, meticulously organized robbery. Lay possessed a calm demeanor and a sharp mind, making him the perfect lieutenant for the newly formed syndicate known informally as the Wild Bunch. They wore plain, dust-covered work clothes, pulling their wide-brimmed hats low to blend in with the transient laborers, drifters, and cattlemen constantly moving through the noisy settlement. Their stout Colt revolvers remained hidden but easily accessible beneath their long canvas coats, fully loaded with brass cartridges. The gang members had spent the previous 2 weeks observing the distinct routines of the train schedules and the company cashier. They noted when the payroll arrived at the depot the path the employees followed toward the Pleasant Valley Coal Company building and the sheltered space beneath the exterior stairs. This reconnaissance provided the precise timing required for a daylight interception, a bold strategy designed to strike during the short walk between transportation and security, while the town remained distracted by the arriving train. Cassidy and Lay selected the shadow beneath the stairs as their position, allowing the intended victims to approach within a few steps before the concealed weapons appeared. A loud, shrill train whistle echoed off the steep sandstone cliffs, signaling the arrival of the noon locomotive. The monumental black iron engine chugged into the canyon, spewing white steam and gray smoke into the already polluted sky. The metal wheels screeched violently against the steel tracks, throwing sparks into the dirt as the ponderous machine ground to a halt beside the wooden boarding platform. A dense crowd of miners, merchants, and company officials surged forward, creating a chaotic, noisy atmosphere that masked the quiet movement of the payroll employees through the settlement. Cassidy and Lay remained near the main company building, watching the route from beneath the elevated stairs with their hands close to their hidden revolvers. E.L. Carpenter, the cashier for the Pleasant Valley Coal Company, left the depot accompanied by another employee carrying the payroll sacks. Carpenter held a bulging canvas bag in his hands containing silver coin valued in the surviving court records at roughly $1,000. The second man walked beside him, scanning the chaotic crowd with a routine expression, entirely unaware that two armed outlaws waited near the entrance ahead. They began the short walk toward the company office, surrounded by miners anticipating their hard-earned wages and by the ordinary confusion produced whenever the train entered the narrow canyon. Cassidy stepped from beneath the exterior stairs as Carpenter approached, the higher entrance of the company building. Lay moved with him, closing the narrow passage and bringing the two outlaws within arm's reach of the canvas sacks. Carpenter did not register the waiting men as a threat until Cassidy shifted directly into his path, effectively blocking the route to the office door. The cashier looked up, annoyance flashing across his face, preparing to demand that the strangers clear the entrance while the second employee attempted to move around the obstruction and continue toward the protected interior. Before Carpenter could speak a single word, Cassidy swept back his canvas coat and leveled the dark barrel of his Colt revolver directly at the cashier's chest. The metallic click of the hammer drawing back cut through the ambient noise of the crowd, a chilling sound that froze the blood in Carpenter's veins. Lay mirrored the action, drawing his own weapon and aiming it squarely at the second employee, his eyes cold and unblinking. The command from the outlaws came low, calm, and utterly devoid of panic, instructing the men to drop the payroll sacks, raise their hands, and make no movement that could be interpreted as resistance. The shocking reality of a daytime robbery paralyzed the company men, their minds struggling to process the brazen assault occurring beside the main office. The second employee's hand twitched toward his clothing, but a slight threatening movement of Lay's revolver barrel stopped the defensive action entirely. Carpenter, staring down the bore of a loaded weapon, realized his life held infinitely more value than the corporate currency in his hands. He released his grip on the coarse fabric, allowing the weighty bag of silver coins to drop toward the dirt beneath the stairs while the surrounding noise briefly concealed the confrontation from much of the crowd. Cassidy anticipated the drop, leaning down and catching the sack before it struck the ground, his shoulder muscles straining against the sudden burden. The raw physical strength required to hoist the silver upward with one arm demonstrated years of brutal labor in the wilderness, pulling the payroll securely against his body without lowering the revolver in his other hand. He kept the weapon aimed at Carpenter the entire time, never breaking visual contact, ensuring total dominance over the terrified cashier. Lay maintained his lethal overwatch on the second employee, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, prepared to unleash force if the man made a single aggressive movement or attempted to call for help. The entire interaction consumed less than 30 seconds, a flawless display of synchronized intimidation and rapid asset acquisition. With the silver secured, Cassidy and Lay began backing toward their horses, keeping their weapons trained on the company men to prevent any sudden heroics. One of the outlaws whirled his revolver and fired several shots into the air and surrounding ground, creating the confusion described by witnesses the following day. The crowd scattered from the noise, opening a path through the settlement as the robbers reached their waiting mounts and prepared to exploit the brief paralysis caused by the gunfire. Cassidy swung into the saddle, turning the animal sharply and breaking into a full gallop down the center of the muddy street, heading away from the company building. Lay followed close behind, acting as the rear guard, constantly checking their back trail to monitor the reaction of the stunned townspeople. A few armed citizens rushed out of the nearby buildings, raising rifles toward the fleeing riders, but the outlaws were already pushing past the final wooden shacks. The dust kicked up by their horses' hooves formed an obscuring cloud, ruining the line of sight for any potential marksman. The success of the escape relied heavily on disrupting the town's communication lines. Before the local authorities could coordinate a rapid response, as Cassidy and Lay fled toward the halfway house and moved through the Price and Helper area, telegraph wires were cut along their route. One line remained active long enough for Sheriff Donant to receive the alarm and hastily gather a posse of 4 men to follow the outlaws. The delay still granted the riders a substantial head start, allowing them to reach the broken country beyond the mining settlements before an organized pursuit could close the distance. Leaving the steep canyon of Castlegate behind, the riders entered the sprawling, harsh environment of the San Rafael Swell, a jagged landscape of deep fissures and towering rock formations. The temperature rose rapidly, baking the arid soil and sending waves of visible heat shimmering above the dry riverbeds. The bag of silver coins pounded rhythmically against Cassidy's leg, a tangible reminder of the successful daylight seizure that had just transpired. They pushed their mounts hard, navigating the treacherous terrain with expert precision, knowing the local lawmen had organized a physical pursuit despite the damaged telegraph lines. The initial phase of their evasion route utilized pre-planned paths through narrow slot canyons, forcing any following posse to travel single file and significantly slowing their progress. The jagged sandstone walls scraped against their leather boots, the narrow confines amplifying the loud, echoing clopping of the iron horseshoes. They rode for hours without stopping, their faces coated in white alkaline dust, their mouths dry and tasting strongly of salt and grit. The harsh Utah desert acted as a natural fortress, presenting a formidable, often lethal obstacle to inexperienced trackers attempting to follow their trail. Upon reaching a secluded grove of cottonwood trees near a hidden spring, they encountered their first remount station, a crucial element of their overall evasion strategy. A trusted associate waited with fresh, rested horses, holding the reins securely as Cassidy and Lay dismounted from their lathered, exhausted animals. The men worked quickly, transferring their leather saddles and the heavy bag of stolen silver onto the new mounts, securing the cinch straps tightly. They drank deeply from the cool spring water, splashing the liquid over their faces to clear the dust before swinging back into the saddle to resume their rapid flight. The fresh horses surged forward with explosive energy, devouring the miles across the high desert plateaus, leaving the exhausted local posse far behind in the dust. By nightfall, the air turned bitterly cold, slicing through their canvas coats. But the riders did not halt their punishing pace. They relied on the bright moonlight illuminating the pale rock formations to guide them deeper into the untamed wilderness, navigating by familiar landmarks known only to the most hardened criminals. The darkness provided total concealment, allowing them to move undetected across the vast, empty expanse of the territory. Their ultimate destination lay deep within the treacherous, labyrinthine canyons of Robber's Roost, a legendary outlaw sanctuary situated in the exceptionally rugged terrain of southeastern Utah. The area featured a complex network of deep ravines, hidden water sources, and sheer cliff walls, offering perfect defensible positions against large-scale law enforcement incursions. Approaching the perimeter of the roost required intimate knowledge of hidden trails and deceptive switchbacks, ensuring that uninvited guests would quickly become lost and succumb to severe dehydration. The gang utilized this natural fortress as their primary operational base, a secure haven where they could rest, resupply, and divide their illicit earnings. The sun crested the eastern horizon, casting stark shadows across the Red Rock canyons as Cassidy and Lay finally descended into the hidden valley of the Roost. They rode past several armed lookouts stationed high on the cliff faces, trusted men who verified their identities before allowing them passage into the inner sanctuary. The camp consisted of crude wooden corrals, several small canvas tents, and a large central fire pit surrounded by worn saddles and armed men. The arrival of the leaders carrying a sack of corporate silver sent a wave of electric anticipation through the gathered outlaws. Dismounting by the fire, Cassidy dropped the canvas sack onto a flat sandstone slab, the dense coins clinking loudly against the rock surface. He untied the leather cords, peeling back the rough fabric to reveal the bright silver contents to the assembled members of the Wild Bunch. The sight of the substantial haul, secured in broad daylight without a casualty, reinforced Cassidy's leadership over the group. The men gathered around, staring at the physical proof that careful observation, controlled intimidation, and disciplined execution yielded greater rewards than chaotic amateur thievery driven by panic or unnecessary gunfire. The division of the spoils proceeded with strict, unwavering fairness, a core principle that ensured absolute loyalty and prevented internal conflict among the dangerous men. Cassidy carefully counted the silver dollars in smaller denominations, arranging the money into equal piles on the stone surface and ensuring every participant received his promised share without argument. The funds provided independence, allowing the men to purchase ammunition, firearms, provisions, and strong horses available on the western frontier. The influx of capital strengthened the Wild Bunch, transforming a loose collection of rustlers into a better supplied criminal organization capable of operating across greater distances. For Cassidy, the Castle Gate robbery represented the successful application of the rigorous strategic theories he had developed, while pacing his cold, lonely cell in the state penitentiary. He had proven that a small, highly disciplined unit could strike a fortified target in broad daylight, secure a fortune, and vanish without sustaining a single casualty. The reliance on advanced scouting, synchronized action, and severed communication lines completely paralyzed the corporate security forces, leaving them helpless to stop the extraction. The era of the chaotic, violent frontier bandit was dying, replaced by a calculating professional who viewed robbery as a complex logistical puzzle. The news of the daring daylight heist spread rapidly across the Western territories, dominating the front pages of newspapers from Salt Lake City to Denver. Journalists detailed the incredible brazenness of the attack, highlighting the fact that the outlaws had outsmarted the armed guards and the local authorities. The Pleasant Valley Coal Company executives fumed with rage, offering substantial bounties for the capture or death of the men responsible for the humiliating theft. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired by the powerful railroad and mining conglomerates, began compiling extensive files on the elusive syndicate leader. Despite the bounty on his head, Cassidy remained secure within the deep, labyrinthine confines of Robber's Roost, surrounded by fiercely loyal allies. The hostile, arid terrain formed an impenetrable shield against the Pinkerton agents, who lacked the specific wilderness skills required to navigate the deadly slot canyons and hidden plateaus. The group spent their days resting, repairing their gear and practicing their marksmanship, shooting targets set against the towering sandstone walls until their aim reached perfect lethal precision. The smell of gun oil, roasting meat, and wood smoke filled the hidden canyon, a stark contrast to the sterile, oppressive atmosphere of the state penitentiary. Lay proved to be a highly effective partner, managing the logistical details of the camp and ensuring the men maintained a state of constant readiness. He organized the purchase of large quantities of provisions, utilizing trusted intermediaries to acquire flour, coffee, and ammunition from distant settlements without arousing suspicion. Lay also expanded the network of safe houses and relay stations, identifying new remote locations across Colorado and Wyoming to facilitate future operations. The partnership between the two men formed the unshakable foundation of the Wild Bunch, combining Cassidy's brilliant strategic vision with Lay's calm, pragmatic execution. The immense wealth secured at Castle Gate allowed the outlaws to live comfortably for several months, entirely removed from the harsh, grueling labor that defined legitimate frontier existence. They spent their evenings sitting around the campfire, sharing stories and studying hand-drawn maps of the sprawling western rail networks and corporate mining towns. Cassidy analyzed the schedules of the massive Union Pacific trains, identifying new lucrative targets that carried vast sums of currency across the desolate plains. The success of their recent operation bred a profound sense of invincibility among the men, fueling their ambition to strike even larger, more heavily defended targets. The corporate conglomerates, infuriated by the relentless, successful attacks on their wealth, demanded total eradication of the outlaw syndicate operating from the southern deserts. They applied immense political pressure on state officials and federal marshals, funding large posse designed to hunt down the criminals with ruthless, overwhelming force. The frontier transformed into a brutal high-stakes battleground, pitting the financial resources of the eastern monopolies against the specialized wilderness survival skills of the western outlaws. The Pinkerton detectives deployed specialized operatives, utilizing advanced surveillance techniques and an extensive network of paid informants, to slowly tighten the net around the elusive gang. Cassidy understood the escalating threat, recognizing that the sheer volume of money and manpower arrayed against them required a constant, rapid evolution of their criminal tactics. Remaining stationary for too long invited disaster, forcing the group to adopt a mobile, unpredictable operational tempo to survive the manhunt. He began drafting plans for a series of rapid, devastating strikes across multiple territories, designed to confuse the authorities and stretch their resources to the breaking point. The Wild Bunch prepared to unleash a wave of meticulously organized robberies that would permanently cement their terrifying legend across the sprawling American West. The network formed around Cassidy now extended through safe houses, relay stations, hidden camps, and trusted intermediaries scattered across several states and territories. The successful daylight robbery of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company demonstrated how those separate pieces could support a rapid strike and a long escape through isolated country. As the summer months approached, baking the Red Rock canyons in blistering heat, the group finalized preparations for larger operations, packing saddlebags with fresh ammunition, food, and explosives. Robert LeRoy Parker looked out over the vast, empty expanse of the desert, ready to direct that expanding network against the powerful financial institutions of the frontier. The Castle Gate operation stood as a clear demonstration of organized, intelligent criminality, altering the rules of engagement in the rugged Western territories. The stolen silver sat safely in the hidden valley, a physical result of patient observation, decisive intimidation, disrupted communications, and a rapid escape through country the pursuing lawmen struggled to navigate. The Wild Bunch rode out from Robber's Roost, armed, funded, and increasingly confident, leaving baffled deputies searching the canyons and telegraph crews repairing severed lines behind them. The era of the meticulously planned corporate heist had begun, and the vast, sprawling frontier offered an endless supply of isolated targets for the relentless architect of the new outlaw syndicate. June 2nd, 1899. The deep darkness of the Wyoming night concealed the desolate plains surrounding the tiny railway siding at Wilcox. A biting wind swept across the open flats, pushing dried sagebrush tumbleweeds against the elevated gravel bed of the Union Pacific tracks. 6 men waited in the freezing shadows near a wooden trestle bridge, their canvas coats pulled tight against the dropping temperatures. They remained in absolute silence, communicating only through subtle hand gestures as they monitored the distant horizon for the telltale glow of a locomotive headlight. This operation required immense patience and a complete disregard for the crushing weight of the federal laws protecting the transcontinental rail lines. The Union Pacific Overland Flyer represented the pinnacle of industrial transportation, an iron leviathan carrying mail, wealthy passengers, and guarded currency. Intercepting such a formidable machine demanded a level of audacity rarely seen outside of military engagements. The gang had selected this specific, isolated location because the wooden bridge allowed them to divide the train and block the second section following close behind. They planted dynamite beneath the trestle and prepared a red warning lantern, creating a trap designed to stop the first locomotive before forcing it across the bridge. A rhythmic vibration began to tremble through the gravel, sending a low rumble into the boots of the waiting men. The vibration grew steadily into a deafening roar as the locomotive churned through the darkness, its blazing front lamp cutting a sharp white cone through the pitch-black night. The outlaws ignited a red signal lantern, the standard railroad warning for danger ahead, and began waving it violently back and forth across the tracks. The engineer, believing the bridge ahead could be unsafe, threw the iron brake levers with frantic force. The steel wheels locked against the rails, generating a blinding shower of orange sparks and a terrifying, high-pitched screech of tearing metal. The ponderous machine slid forward under its own momentum, stopping before the wooden bridge and hissing clouds of white steam from its pressure valves. Before the train fully ceased moving, two masked men scrambled up the steep gravel embankment, drew their revolvers and rushed the cabin. They leveled their weapons at the stunned engineer and coal-covered fireman, ordering them to move the locomotive across the trestle before the hidden explosive charge detonated behind it. The gang forced the railroad employees to comply through the undeniable threat of lethal force, driving the first section across the bridge before the dynamite exploded behind them. They then instructed the crew to detach the passenger cars from the mail and express cars, physically uncoupling the iron linkages connecting the rear of the train. The terrified workers followed the instructions, leaving the civilian passengers stranded in the dark and separated from the ensuing violence. With the cars divided, the robbers commanded the engineer to pull the locomotive mail car and express car, roughly 2 miles farther down the track to a secondary location. The train rolled forward, leaving the confused and frightened passengers sitting in complete darkness on the remote plains, far from any possible intervention. The locomotive groaned to a halt at the predetermined point, where the open darkness and broken ground concealed the waiting robbers from distant observation. The primary target was the express car, a reinforced wooden and iron box constructed specifically to transport quantities of secure wealth. Inside this rolling vault sat Charles Woodcock, a dedicated messenger tasked with guarding the safes, possessing strict orders to never open the sliding doors under any circumstances. The intruders approached the locked car, banging the barrels of their revolvers against the solid wood and demanding entry. Woodcock remained silent inside, trusting the robust construction of the car and his own shotgun to repel the attackers, adhering rigidly to his protocol. The gang did not waste time with extended verbal negotiations, knowing that every passing minute increased the likelihood of a delayed railway patrol discovering the stranded passenger cars. They transitioned swiftly to their destructive method of entry, retrieving a canvas sack filled with volatile sticks of commercial dynamite from their saddlebags. One of the men carefully arranged a bundle of explosive charges against the iron frame of the sliding door, securing them with twine and attaching a waxed fuse. The men backed away rapidly, scrambling down the gravel embankment and taking cover behind a large outcropping of weathered sandstone. A match flared in the darkness, the yellow flame touching the end of the fuse, sending a trail of sparks sizzling rapidly toward the explosive bundle. The resulting blast shattered the quiet night, sending a shockwave of raw concussive force rolling across the plains and ringing the ears of everyone present. The explosion obliterated the wooden door, ripping the hinges from their bolts and showering the surrounding area with jagged splinters of timber. Acrid smoke poured from the gaping hole in the side of the car, smelling strongly of sulfur, burnt wood, and explosives. The outlaws rushed forward, climbing through the shattered entrance with their weapons drawn. stepping over the ruined debris covering the floorboards. Inside, they found Woodcock dazed and bleeding from a severe concussion, the sheer force of the blast having thrown him against the rear wall of the compartment. They dragged the disoriented messenger out of the ruined car, dropping him roughly onto the gravel bed below to ensure he posed no further threat. Their attention turned instantly to the iron safe bolted securely to the floor, a formidable vault manufactured to withstand immense physical punishment. The standard combination lock presented a significant obstacle, requiring specialized tools or additional calibrated destructive force to breach the metal plating. The gang opted for speed over precision, preparing a second, larger charge of dynamite to crack the stubborn shell. They packed the explosive sticks tightly against the main locking mechanism, using wet clay scooped from a nearby creek bed to direct the force of the blast inward. This complex task required steady hands and a deep understanding of explosive properties, as a miscalculation could easily destroy the valuable contents secured within. They lit the second fuse and sprinted away from the car, diving behind the rocky cover once again, and covering their heads to protect against the incoming shrapnel. The second explosion dwarfed the first, a catastrophic eruption of fire and sound that violently rocked the locomotive on its wheels. The blast tore the reinforced safe completely apart, shearing the door off its hinges and driving it straight through the wooden ceiling of the express car. The tremendous force completely pulverized the interior of the vault, destroying the cash drawers and sending a blinding flurry of paper currency swirling into the night air. Thousands of dollars in crisp banknotes fluttered down onto the sagebrush and the gravel tracks like a surreal, valuable snowstorm. The robbers scrambled out of their cover, cursing loudly at the unexpected magnitude of the blast, rushing forward to gather the scattered wealth. They crawled through the dirt and the smoking debris, frantically stuffing handfuls of intact bills and canvas sacks of silver coins into their own collection bags. The smell of burning paper mixed with the sharp tang of explosive powder as they stomped out small fires ignited by the blast, desperately trying to save the smoldering currency. Despite the chaotic aftermath and the destruction of a portion of the money, they successfully secured a staggering fortune totaling roughly $30,000. This haul firmly categorized the Wilcox operation as one of the most lucrative and destructive train robberies ever committed on the western frontier. The men loaded the bulging sacks of currency onto their waiting horses, securing the loads tightly with rawhide straps. They swung into their saddles, leaving the smoking express car and the stunned railroad employees behind in the desolate wilderness. They spurred their powerful mounts forward, galloping fiercely into the dark, expansive terrain, initiating the first phase of a pre-planned evasion route. The success of the operation now depended entirely on their ability to outrun the unprecedented corporate response that would inevitably follow the sunrise. The news of the Wilcox robbery traveled across the telegraph wires with lightning speed, reaching the executive offices of the Union Pacific Railroad in Omaha by early morning. E. H. Harriman, the ruthless president of the rail conglomerate, received the report with furious, unyielding anger. He viewed the attack not merely as a financial loss, but as a direct, unacceptable insult to his personal authority and the security of his sprawling empire. Harriman possessed limitless financial resources and vowed to spend whatever sums were required to hunt down and completely destroy the men responsible for the audacious strike. Harriman authorized the formation of specialized mobile posse trains, consisting of reinforced boxcars loaded with top-tier horses, stockpiles of ammunition, and armed lawmen. These rapid response locomotives functioned as rolling military bases capable of deploying fresh equipped trackers to any point along the rail line within hours. The railroad also contracted the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, unleashing a network of professional investigators tasked specifically with dismantling the Wild Bunch. The Pinkertons operated without jurisdictional boundaries, utilizing advanced surveillance methods, paid informants, and relentless physical tracking to pursue their targets. The scale of the manhunt surpassed anything previously seen in the Western Territories, transforming the pursuit into a mechanized war against the outlaws. Dozens of skilled trackers, including local sheriffs, federal marshals, and corporate detectives, converged on the smoldering wreckage of the express car at Wilcox. They brought trained bloodhounds, aggressive dogs bred specifically to follow human scent over long distances across the harshest, most unforgiving terrain. The loud, deep baying of the hounds echoed across the plains, signaling the commencement of a brutal chase that would test the physical limits of every man involved. The fugitives utilized their extensive knowledge of the local geography, riding hard toward the jagged peaks and confusing canyons of the region. They rode through shallow rivers and rocky stream beds, deliberately attempting to wash away their scent and confuse the trailing dogs. The harsh Wyoming landscape presented a punishing obstacle course of steep inclines, loose shale, and thorny brush that tore at the legs of their horses. They relied on their established network of hidden relay stations, swapping their exhausted animals for fresh, strong mounts waiting in secluded valleys. The physical demands of the evasion proved excruciating, requiring the men to spend consecutive days in the saddle with virtually no sleep and restricted rations. The blistering sun baked the alkaline dust into their skin during the day, while the plunging nighttime temperatures caused violent shivering and stiff, agonizing muscle cramps. They constantly monitored their back trail, using field glasses to scan the horizon for the dust clouds indicating the approach of the posses. The relentless pressure forced them to maintain a punishing pace across terrain that would easily cripple lesser riders. A deadly confrontation occurred at Dugout Creek, roughly 10 miles north of Casper, where a persistent posse led by Converse County Sheriff Joe Hazen managed to close the distance significantly. The lawmen pushed their horses to the brink of collapse, finally catching sight of the fleeing outlaws as they moved through the broken country. Gunfire erupted across the rocky expanse, the loud cracks of Winchester rifles echoing violently through the open terrain. The outlaws dismounted, utilizing the natural cover to return accurate, suppressive fire against their heavily armed pursuers. During the chaotic firefight, Sheriff Hazen sustained a fatal gunshot wound to the abdomen, collapsing into the dirt and severely demoralizing the remaining posse members. The gang capitalized on the disruption, remounting their horses under fire and pushing deeper into the impenetrable, rugged wilderness. The death of a prominent lawman elevated the severity of their crimes to the highest possible level, guaranteeing that the pursuit would never cease until every member of the syndicate was captured or killed. The stakes had reached an absolute pinnacle. There was no possibility of surrender, no chance for leniency, and no safe harbor left outside of their most remote sanctuaries. The fleeing men continued their desperate flight toward the Hole-in-the-Wall Valley, a legendary natural fortress surrounded by sheer red cliffs and accessible only through narrow, easily defended passes. The difficult journey required them to cross swollen, freezing rivers and navigate treacherous mountain trails completely obscured by darkness. Their boots filled with freezing water and their clothing remained constantly soaked, bringing them dangerously close to severe hypothermia during the long, agonizing nights. They pushed their physical endurance past the breaking point, driven entirely by the primal instinct to survive the net closing around them. Reaching the hidden valley provided a brief, vital respite from the continuous, agonizing pressure of the chase. The towering cliff walls offered total concealment and exceptional defensive advantages, allowing the men to finally rest their exhausted bodies and tend to their sore, battered horses. They divided the stack of scorched and torn currency, carefully separating the usable bills from the completely destroyed fragments. The sheer volume of the wealth acquired during the Wilcox operation provided immense financial security, but the cost came in the form of a permanent visible target placed squarely on their backs. The Pinkerton agency refused to abandon the pursuit, establishing a permanent presence in the towns bordering the outlaw sanctuaries. They plastered thousands of wanted posters across the territory, offering staggering sums of reward money for any information leading to the capture of the syndicate members. The bounties turned every drifter, bartender, and ranch hand into a potential informant, severely restricting the outlaw's ability to interact with the legitimate world. Trust became a scarce, dangerous commodity, forcing the gang to rely exclusively on a tiny, deeply vetted circle of loyal associates. The detectives utilized advanced analytical techniques to track the movement of the stolen banknotes, identifying specific serial numbers and tracing them as they circulated through the frontier economy. Whenever a torn or scorched bill surfaced in a local saloon or general store, Pinkerton agents quickly descended on the location, aggressively interrogating the patrons and tracing the financial thread backward. This systemic method of investigation represented a massive leap in law enforcement capability, proving that the wilderness could no longer provide permanent anonymity. The syndicate found themselves fighting a complex war against an adversary that utilized data and logistics just as effectively as weapons and bloodhounds. To counter the escalating threat, the group adopted increasingly sophisticated methods of concealment and misdirection, constantly shifting their operational bases across multiple states. They utilized complex codes and encrypted messages when communicating with their network of supporters, ensuring that intercepted letters provided no actionable intelligence to the authorities. They spent vast sums of money purchasing the silence of local officials and securing the loyalty of remote ranchers who provided essential supplies and fresh horses. The operation transformed into an entrenched insurgency against the combined forces of the federal government and the industrial monopolies. The Wilcox train robbery forced the entire Western law enforcement apparatus to evolve rapidly, abandoning the outdated methods of disorganized local posses in favor of specialized task forces. The railroad companies funded the creation of permanent rapid response security teams stationed at strategic points along the transcontinental routes, hardening their infrastructure against future assaults. The era of the easy, unopposed train heist vanished entirely, replaced by a dangerous, fortified environment that required intense planning and immense physical risk to breach. The outlaws had successfully secured a fortune, but they had also inadvertently triggered the creation of the very mechanisms that would ultimately ensure their destruction. The robbers did not remain together beside one campfire for long, understanding that a concentrated group created a single trail for the posses to follow. They divided into smaller parties and moved along separate routes, forcing the pursuing lawmen to scatter their manpower across an immense section of Wyoming. Fresh horses, hidden supplies, and trusted ranches allowed the fugitives to keep moving after the official posses had exhausted their animals. The same loose organization that complicated daily control of the gang now became a defensive advantage, allowing individual groups to disappear into different stretches of the frontier. The physical and psychological toll of the continuous evasion began to manifest, testing the unity and the discipline of the syndicate. The constant paranoia, the inability to sleep deeply, and the necessity of looking over their shoulders at all times created a toxic, stressful environment. Every snapping branch or distant rustle of sagebrush triggered an aggressive, defensive reaction, forcing the men to live in a perpetual state of hypervigilance. The wealth they possessed offered no comfort, serving only as a dangerous burden that required constant protection from the thousands of men hunting them. Despite the mounting pressure, the core leadership maintained their cold, calculating focus. refusing to succumb to the panic that destroyed lesser criminal organizations. They understood that their survival depended on maintaining total discipline, utilizing their superior tactical knowledge and executing their movements with flawless precision. The Wilcox operation had escalated the conflict to an unprecedented level of violence and corporate retaliation, setting the stage for a prolonged, brutal war of attrition. The Wild Bunch remained free, well-armed, and exceptionally wealthy, preparing to confront the forces determined to erase them from the Western landscape. September 19th, 1900. A dry, scouring wind swept across the barren Nevada basin, driving sharp grains of sand against the wooden facades of Winnemucca. The isolated settlement functioned as a vital commercial hub for the sprawling cattle ranches and deep-vein mining camps scattered across the unforgiving high desert. At the center of this harsh economy stood the First National Bank, a sturdy brick structure housing the aggregated wealth of the entire surrounding territory. The noon sun beat down relentlessly on the dirt thoroughfare, driving the local citizens indoors and leaving the streets largely deserted. 3 riders approached the town from the east, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed felt hats and their bodies cloaked in heavy, dust-covered canvas coats. Robert LeRoy Parker guided his weary horse toward the financial institution, accompanied by Harry Longabaugh and a third Wild Bunch gunman whose identity would remain disputed in later accounts. The trio operated with a cold, practiced efficiency, their movements devoid of nervous hesitation or wasted energy as they blended into the ordinary traffic of the commercial street. They dismounted near the wooden boardwalk, secured the reins of their horses, and moved toward the bank without masks concealing their faces. Their revolvers and a Winchester rifle remained close at hand beneath their clothing as all 3 men stepped through the large glass doors and entered the busy public room together, relying on speed rather than concealment. The interior of the building offered a cool, shaded contrast to the blinding glare of the Nevada sun, smelling of polished oak, paper currency, and the dust carried inside by customers. Bank President George S. Nixon stood among employees and local patrons conducting the ordinary business of the day, entirely unaware of the lethal threat that had entered unmasked. The robbers drew 2 revolvers and a Winchester rifle with sudden, startling speed, sweeping the weapons across the crowded room and ordering everyone to remain still. One gunman closed the distance to Nixon, pressing the cold steel barrel against him and demanding immediate access to the vault, while the other 2 controlled every visible doorway and possible route to an alarm. Parker moved behind the counter while Longabaugh and the third gunman controlled the customers and employees gathered inside the bank, forcing hands upward and preventing any sudden movement toward the street. Nixon, trembling violently and gasping for breath, was driven toward the main vault at the rear of the office under the direct pressure of a loaded weapon. The bank president understood the violent reputation of frontier robbers and recognized that any resistance could result in a fatal gunshot wound before help entered the building. He worked the heavy locking mechanism, pulled the thick steel handle, and opened the iron door to reveal stacked bags of gold coin resting on the shelves, each representing deposits and commercial reserves entrusted to the institution. The outlaws filled their sacks with $32,640 in gold coin, the immense weight of the precious metal straining their shoulder muscles as the contents accumulated. The staggering sum represented deposits tied to the commercial activity of the surrounding cattle ranches, mines, merchants, and wealthy regional investors. Each robber kept a weapon trained on the room while the dense bags were dragged from the vault and carried toward the rear exit, preventing any employee or customer from reaching an alarm or attempting a desperate intervention. Boots thudded against the wooden floorboards. Coins shifted heavily inside the canvas, and the entire seizure moved with brutal speed, compressing the controlled occupation of the bank into only a few breathless minutes. Before leaving, the robbers forced Nixon, his employees, and the customers into a fenced enclosure behind the bank, hiding them from passers-by and delaying the alarm that would otherwise have spread immediately through town. The three men carried the dense sacks through the back door and threw them across the saddle horns of their waiting mounts, struggling briefly with the crushing weight of the gold. They swung into the saddles and fired shots into the air as the horses surged forward, one heavy bag falling and forcing a rider to stop, recover it, and wrestle his spooked animal back under control. The momentary delay nearly cost them their lead, but the trio recovered and raced away before the rapidly forming posse could close the distance. The evasion route took them deep into the hostile, parched environment of the Great Basin, a sprawling wasteland of cracked earth and jagged mountain ranges. The harsh terrain offered no natural shade or comfort, presenting a formidable obstacle to the heavily laden horses navigating the sharp, uneven rocks. They relied heavily on their intimate knowledge of hidden springs and remote water caches to survive the punishing ride across the arid expanse. The heavy bags of gold pounded rhythmically against their legs, a constant reminder of the massive fortune they had successfully extracted from the Nevada bank. Any pursuing posse would face a lethal environment, lacking the specialized geographical knowledge required to survive the brutal crossing of the desolate salt flats. The scorching heat threatened to dehydrate both the men and their animals, forcing them to push their mounts to the brink of physical collapse. They rode relentlessly through the sweltering afternoon and deep into the freezing pitch-black night without stopping to rest their aching muscles. The plunging temperatures chilled the sweat on their skin, causing violent shivering as they navigated the treacherous mountain passes illuminated only by starlight. The raw physical endurance required to complete this journey separated professional outlaws from amateur thieves who would easily perish in such unforgiving conditions. They pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that their stolen wealth promised an eventual escape from this brutal existence. Upon reaching a prearranged safe haven in the remote canyons, the men finally dismounted, their bodies coated in a thick crust of dried sweat and dirt. They built a small, smokeless fire using dry sagebrush and began the process of dividing the stolen wealth, separating the gold coins onto a woven blanket. The firelight glinted off the stacked metal, illuminating the exhausted but triumphant faces of the men who had just executed a flawless robbery. They counted the eagles and double eagles meticulously, ensuring every member of the gang received an equal share of the staggering payday. The heavy coins represented tangible freedom, a massive influx of capital that altered the fundamental trajectory of their criminal enterprise. The sheer volume of the currency provided an unprecedented level of financial independence, elevating the gang far beyond the status of common rural thieves. They possessed enough capital to purchase political favors, secure advanced weaponry, and vanish into the most luxurious environments the country had to offer. The grueling reality of sleeping on the hard ground and eating dried provisions suddenly lost its appeal in the face of such readily available wealth. They sat by the fire, nursing their sore muscles and discussing the vast possibilities that lay outside the boundaries of the unforgiving western desert. The harsh outlaw trail had finally yielded a prize large enough to finance a permanent departure from their violent, precarious lifestyle. The three robbers made their way south toward the sprawling, rapidly modernizing urban centers of Texas, carrying enough money to abandon the immediate hardships of the northern wilderness and enjoy a period of conspicuous luxury. The journey required weeks of careful travel, avoiding major railway hubs, telegraph stations, and patrolled thoroughfares while navigating the vast plains with practiced stealth. They aimed for Fort Worth, a booming cattle town that offered a unique blend of sophisticated commerce and a deeply permissive criminal underworld. The city presented the perfect environment for wealthy outlaws seeking to spend freely indulge in the finest luxuries available on the frontier without immediately revealing the source of their fortune. Arriving in Tarrant County, the outlaws navigated the crowded, chaotic streets of Fort Worth, blending in with the massive influx of transient ranchers and wealthy buyers. The city pulsed with industrial energy, featuring towering brick buildings, electric streetlights, and a dense concentration of saloons, gambling parlors, and high-end brothels. The southern portion of the city, widely known as Hell's Half Acre, operated outside the rigid constraints of standard law enforcement, protected by bribed local officials. The district thrived on vice and illicit commerce, providing a secure, anonymous playground for men possessing deep pockets and a desire for unrestricted entertainment. The gang rented expensive, lavishly furnished rooms in a premium boarding house, securing a comfortable base of operations far removed from the dirt of the outlaw trail. The men initiated a radical transformation of their outward appearance, seeking to erase all physical traces of their violent rural profession. They discarded their stained, dust-caked canvas coats, their worn leather boots, and their sweat-ruined felt hats, leaving the filthy garments piled in their rented rooms. Stepping into the humid Texas air, they visited the finest haberdasheries and custom tailors operating within the affluent commercial districts of the city. They commissioned multiple expensive suits constructed from imported English wool, featuring sharp, modern cuts alien to their previous rugged lifestyle. The tailors measured their broad shoulders and thick chests, adjusting the fine fabrics to accommodate the concealed firearms the men refused to leave behind. The spending spree continued with the purchase of premium accessories designed to project an aura of supreme, unshakable wealth and elevated social status. They bought expensive bowler hats, abandoning the wide-brimmed Stetsons that marked them as crude laborers or trail-hardened cowboys. They selected polished, handcrafted leather shoes, a stark departure from the heavy, spur-scarred riding boots they had worn for their entire adult lives. Thick gold watch chains draped across their tailored vests, and imported silk ties adorned their crisp, starched white cotton collars. The physical transformation proved flawless, turning the most wanted lethal fugitives in the country into a group of impeccably dressed, wealthy urban gentlemen. This extreme shift in their material circumstances triggered a profound, dangerous psychological change within the minds of the outlaws. The massive success of the Winnemucca heist, combined with their ability to evade the combined forces of the regional law enforcement, bred a blinding arrogance. They walked the crowded streets of Fort Worth with supreme confidence, convinced that their superior intelligence and vast financial resources rendered them untouchable. The constant paranoia and hypervigilance that had kept them alive in the wilderness evaporated, replaced by a reckless, unearned sense of absolute invincibility. They believed they had outsmarted the Pinkerton detective agency, the railroad monopolies, and the entire federal justice system. Joined by fellow syndicate members Harvey Logan and Ben Kilpatrick, the expanded group fully embraced the opulent, indulgent lifestyle offered by the corrupt city. They dined in the most expensive restaurants, consuming thick steaks, imported French wines, and premium aged whiskey, a massive contrast to the meager rations of the trail. They spent entire evenings in high-stakes gambling parlors, casually pushing large stacks of gold coins across the green felt tables without a second thought. The local politicians and corrupt police officers gladly accepted their generous bribes, ensuring the wealthy strangers received total immunity from any municipal scrutiny. The outlaws basked in their success, blind to the catastrophic error they were preparing to commit. Late in the year, the five men strolled down the bustling brick pavement of Main Street, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the admiring glances of the local citizens. Their pockets bulged with stolen currency, and their expensive suits fit flawlessly, prompting a collective desire to permanently document their triumph. They passed the large, ornate glass window of John Swartz's photography studio, a premier establishment known for producing professional portraits for the Texas elite. The fatal idea formulated quickly among the men. They decided to commission a formal group photograph, a physical monument to their wealth and their unbreakable brotherhood. They climbed the narrow wooden staircase leading to the second-floor studio, their polished shoes clicking softly against the treads, walking willingly into their own destruction. The interior of the photography studio smelled sharply of pungent chemicals, a potent mixture of ether, alcohol, and silver nitrate utilized in the development process. A massive, heavy wooden camera dominated the center of the room, perched securely atop a thick tripod and pointed toward an illuminated staging area. John Swartz, a meticulous tradesman, greeted the well-dressed group with polite deference, entirely unaware he was hosting the most dangerous criminal syndicate in the nation. The Outlaws requested a premium large-format portrait, tossing a heavy gold coin onto the counter to secure the photographer's undivided attention and his finest materials. Swartz eagerly accepted the commission, gesturing for the men to step in front of a painted canvas backdrop depicting a civilized, classical scene. The staging of the portrait required careful coordination, creating the physical arrangement preserved in the most famous image of the Wild Bunch. Longabaugh sat on the left of the front row. Ben Kilpatrick occupied the center chair, and Parker sat on the right, each man dressed as an affluent urban gentleman rather than a hunted frontier outlaw. Will Carver stood behind Longabaugh on the left, while Harvey Logan stood behind Parker on the right, their hands resting in the formal group arrangement favored by portrait studios of the period. They adjusted their bowler hats, straightened their imported silk ties, settled their coats, and ensured their expensive gold pocket watches were fully visible, embracing the vanity and civilized appearance that made the resulting photograph so striking. Swartz retreated behind the bulky wooden camera, sliding a heavy glass plate coated in light-sensitive chemical emulsion into the rear of the device. He draped a thick, dark cloth over his head to block the ambient light, adjusting the brass dials to bring the 5 outlaws into sharp focus on the ground glass screen. He instructed the men to remain perfectly still, warning them that the slightest movement would ruin the exposure and require a second attempt. The outlaws held their breath, freezing their facial muscles into confident, unyielding expressions, staring directly into the dark, circular lens of the camera. The photographer raised a long metal trough filled with combustible magnesium powder, preparing to illuminate the dimly lit room. The magnesium ignited with a blinding, brilliant flash of white light, an intense sudden burst that overwhelmed the retinas of everyone in the studio. The brilliant illumination exposed every sharp angle, every distinctive scar, and every minute facial feature of the men to the sensitive chemicals coating the glass plate. A billowing cloud of white, acrid smoke rolled toward the ceiling, smelling strongly of burnt metal and ozone, as the camera shutter snapped shut with a decisive click. In that single fraction of a second, the Wild Bunch surrendered their greatest defensive asset, transferring their precise likenesses onto a fragile pane of glass. The men blinked away the bright spots in their vision, entirely ignorant of the monumental fatal mistake they had just executed. They paid Swartz a premium price for his services, requesting several quality paper copies to be printed and held for their collection later in the week. The outlaws descended the wooden stairs, laughing and joking among themselves, returning to the crowded streets of Fort Worth to continue their indulgent celebration. Inside the studio, Swartz carried the exposed glass plate into his darkroom, initiating the complex chemical process required to develop the negative and reveal the captured image. He submerged the glass in a series of harsh chemical baths, watching as the sharp, detailed faces of the 5 men slowly materialized in the dim amber light. The resulting photograph boasted exceptional clarity, an absolute masterpiece of early portraiture that perfectly captured the arrogant, wealthy demeanor of his subjects. Recognizing the exceptional quality of his own work, Swartz made a fateful commercial decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of the criminal syndicate. He printed an extra-large format copy of the portrait, mounting the image on a stiff cardboard backing and placing it prominently in his street-level display window. He intended the photograph to serve as a compelling advertisement for his studio, showcasing his ability to capture the sophisticated elegance of affluent, modern gentlemen. The image sat behind the thick glass, visible to the thousands of pedestrians, ranchers, and businessmen who walked along Main Street every single day. The outlaws' faces, once hidden behind canvas masks and the blinding dust of the trail, were now publicly exhibited in the center of a major metropolitan hub. The disaster initiated when a lawman familiar with Western criminals recognized the significance of the portrait hanging in Swartz's gallery. Competing accounts later credited either Fort Worth police detective Charles R. Scott or Wells Fargo detective Fred Dodge, with first connecting the elegant faces in the studio image to members of the Wild Bunch. Both men possessed extensive knowledge of Western offenders, aliases, arrests, and the faded visual records then available to investigators. The expensive suits and bowler hats could not conceal the hardened features already known through scattered descriptions, prison photographs, and previous encounters. The observer understood that the studio had accidentally produced the most valuable visual evidence yet obtained against the elusive outlaw network, capturing 5 wanted men together with a clarity no witness sketch could approach. A copy of the photograph was obtained from John Swartz and forwarded to the Pinkerton office in Denver, where agents treated it as their first decisive visual break in the case. The crisp print preserved every facial angle, expression, and distinguishing feature, with a clarity that hand-drawn sketches and conflicting witness descriptions had never provided. Investigators separated the group portrait into individual likenesses, matching the men to aliases, criminal records, known associates, and reports gathered across the West over several years. The investigative apparatus, previously hindered by inadequate visual data, suddenly possessed an instrument capable of identifying the gang far beyond Texas and linking strangers in distant towns to the names buried in Pinkerton files. Pinkerton agents studied the photograph and compared it with their expanding files on the men who had blown apart train safes, robbed banks, killed lawmen, and repeatedly escaped organized pursuit. For years, detectives had chased shifting names and uncertain descriptions that often bore little resemblance to the actual fugitives once they changed clothing, grew facial hair, or crossed into another jurisdiction. Now the agency possessed a sharp group portrait exposing the current appearances of 5 central figures in a single frame, with each face capable of being enlarged and reproduced separately. The photograph became the foundation for a new international circular, allowing investigators to connect names, aliases, associates, crimes, physical descriptions, and recognizable faces with unprecedented precision while sharing the same intelligence across offices that had previously worked from incomplete fragments. By May 15, 1901, the Pinkerton agency had reproduced individual faces from the Fort Worth portrait on circulars distributed widely to law enforcement in North and South America. The flyers combined the photographs with physical descriptions, known aliases, criminal histories, associates, likely refugees, and substantial financial rewards offered by banks and railroads. Copies reached police departments, sheriff's offices, railway stations, ports, hotels, border posts, and international authorities wherever the fugitives were likely to seek transportation or refuge. The faces of Parker, Longabaugh, Logan, Carver, and Kilpatrick became permanent entries in the expanding visual records of professional law enforcement. A local studio portrait created as a joke had been converted into a standardized identification tool capable of crossing state lines and national borders faster than the men themselves could safely travel. The 5 men had already left Fort Worth before the full consequences of the portrait became visible, dispersing as pressure increased and the loose syndicate began to fracture under separate investigations. Their departure was not triggered by a freshly printed flyer placed directly in their hands. But the image soon made every later movement more dangerous by giving distant officers a reliable standard for comparison. Carver would be killed in Texas before the international circular appeared, while other members faced arrest, gunfights, or violent pursuit in different states. The photograph did not create the manhunt, and it did not instantly scatter the group from the city, but it gave the existing campaign a level of visual accuracy the surviving outlaws could never reverse through new clothing or another borrowed name. Within months, the group portrait followed the surviving fugitives, farther than any local posse could ride, reproduced in offices, depots, hotels, and transportation hubs across national borders. Parker and Longabaugh had already turned east and prepared to leave the United States, while agents used the new likenesses to trace associates, question contacts, compare sightings, and anticipate possible destinations. Fine clothing, altered names, shaved faces, and distant cities no longer guaranteed anonymity once their features could be measured against a clear printed image held by investigators. The photograph also allowed separate agencies to discuss the same men without relying entirely on vague verbal descriptions. The single studio sitting became a durable piece of evidence, remaining useful long after the 5 subjects had abandoned Fort Worth, divided their routes, and scattered across the continent under different identities. The sitting in John Swartz's studio marked the end of the Wild Bunch's reliable anonymity, even though it did not single-handedly cause their immediate flight from Texas. The fortune secured at Winnemucca financed a period of luxury, but it also placed the men together in front of a camera at the precise moment photographic identification was becoming a powerful law enforcement tool. Their strategic planning had protected routes, horses, weapons, hideouts, and trusted intermediaries, yet failed to account for the permanent danger created by a clear group portrait that could be copied endlessly. The era of the faceless frontier bandit was closing, and the camera shutter preserved the image that would follow the surviving fugitives beyond the American West. February 20th, 1901. The freezing, salt-laced wind blowing off the Hudson River whipped across Pier 32 in New York City, cutting through the dense coastal fog. Moored against the stout wooden pylons sat the British steamship Herminius, an immense iron vessel preparing for a long transatlantic voyage. Cargo cranes groaned under dense loads, swinging wooden crates of machinery and textiles into the cavernous lower holds. The chaotic port teemed with dock workers, customs officials, and passengers shouting over the deafening hiss of released steam valves. 3 figures stood near the boarding ramp, clutching leather travel trunks and wearing expensive wool coats. Robert LeRoy Parker held a forged boarding pass bearing the alias James Ryan, his posture stiff inside a tailored worsted wool suit. Beside him stood Harry Longabaugh, operating under the name Harry A. Place, accompanied by a young, elegant woman known only as Etta Place. They projected the perfect image of a wealthy businessman traveling with a respectable married couple for overseas commercial interests. Beneath the fine imported fabrics, however, the men carried loaded Colt revolvers pressed tight against their ribs in custom shoulder holsters. The transition from the rugged canyons of the West to the civilized industrial harbor of the East Coast required flawless, unwavering deception. The decision to abandon the United States entirely stemmed directly from the unrelenting nationwide dragnet triggered by their past actions. Every railway station, telegraph office, and hotel lobby from San Francisco to Boston currently displayed their faces on printed Pinkerton handbills. The enormous corporate bounties had incentivized thousands of private detectives and local police officers to scour the country for the famous fugitives. The western frontier no longer offered a secure sanctuary, its vastness conquered by rapidly expanding communication networks and specialized tracking teams. Survival dictated a radical relocation beyond the jurisdictional reach of the federal government and the vengeful railroad monopolies. Parker watched the dock guards closely, his eyes scanning the chaotic crowd for men wearing the trademark bowler hats favored by agency detectives. He knew Pinkerton operatives actively monitored the major eastern ports, searching for fleeing criminals attempting to board international vessels. The tension radiating through his muscles felt intense, every passing uniform triggering a spike of adrenaline and a subtle shift toward his hidden firearm. The trio moved forward in the boarding line, shuffling slowly toward the purser's desk positioned at the top of the wooden gangway. Longabaugh presented his documents first, slipping a folded stack of legitimate American currency across the small table alongside the forged travel papers. The ship's officer inspected the tickets, glancing briefly at Etta, whose calm, aristocratic demeanor effectively deflected any potential suspicion. The officer stamped the paperwork and directed them toward the first-class passenger deck, unaware he had just permitted the most wanted men in America to slip through the net. Parker followed, producing his own matching documentation and receiving the same mundane bureaucratic approval to board the vessel. Stepping onto the polished teak deck of the Herminius, the outlaws felt the constant, subtle vibration of the coal-fired engines idling deep within the hull. A steward guided them down a narrow brass-lined corridor to their adjoining staterooms, luxurious cabins featuring velvet curtains and plush bedding. Locking the solid wooden doors behind them, the men finally released their grips on their concealed weapons, exhaling long, ragged breaths of relief. The sturdy steel walls of the ship provided a physical barrier against the law enforcement apparatus that had hunted them relentlessly for years. The ship's horn bellowed a deafening low-frequency blast that vibrated through the floorboards, signaling the imminent departure from the harbor. Stout hawsers splashed into the frigid water as deckhands cast off the mooring lines, detaching the vessel from the American continent. Parker stood near a brass porthole, watching the churning gray water widen between the iron hull and the timber pier. The powerful twin screws churned the river into white foam, pushing the ship slowly out into the deeper channels of the bay. Navigating through the harbor, the Herminius passed beneath the imposing copper structure of the Statue of Liberty, an ironic symbol for men fleeing the confines of American justice. The dense, sprawling skyline of Manhattan began to shrink on the horizon, dissolving into the winter fog. The transition felt profound. The outlaws were leaving behind the only landscape they had ever known, severing all ties to their former associates and hidden sanctuaries. The empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean opened before them, a gray, churning void offering absolute anonymity and an untraceable escape route. The maritime journey required a grueling adjustment to the relentless physical realities of deep-water navigation. The vessel pitched and rolled violently through the winter swells, the iron hull groaning under the intense pressure of the crashing waves. Parker and Longabaugh, men accustomed to the firm saddle and the solid rock of the desert, suffered from severe, incapacitating seasickness during the initial weeks. They remained confined to their cabins, their stomachs churning in rhythm with the oceanic turbulence, unable to consume the rich meals prepared in the galley. Etta Place, conversely, demonstrated remarkable physical resilience, adapting quickly to the motion of the ship and navigating the dining rooms with practiced grace. Her presence proved invaluable, maintaining the facade of wealthy tourists, while her male companions recovered from their debilitating nausea. She engaged in polite conversation with the ship's captain and European merchants, projecting a refined intellect that masked her association with lethal criminals. Her ability to operate flawlessly within elite social circles provided the perfect camouflage for the hardened fugitives hiding in the adjacent cabin. As the ship crossed the equator and entered the warmer, calmer waters of the southern hemisphere, the men regained their physical strength and emerged onto the upper decks. The blazing sun and clear blue skies replaced the freezing fog of New York, raising their spirits and confirming the success of their daring evasion. They spent hours leaning against the brass railings, observing flying fish and large whales breaching the surface of the deep indigo water. The constant fear of pursuit slowly began to recede, replaced by a cautious, growing anticipation of the new life awaiting them at the bottom of the world. Following weeks of continuous sailing, the Herminius entered the muddy estuary of the Rio de la Plata, dropping anchor in the bustling port of Buenos Aires. The capital city of Argentina presented a chaotic, overwhelming sensory experience, a rapidly expanding metropolis blending ornate European architecture with raw South American industrialism. The heat hung heavy in the air, potent with the smell of roasting meat, raw leather, and the salty brine of the shallow river. Thousands of immigrants from Italy, Spain, and Britain crowded the docks, creating a deafening cacophony of foreign languages that initially bewildered the newly arrived outlaws. Disembarking with their large travel trunks, the trio navigated through the frantic customs inspections, relying on the universal language of monetary bribes to expedite the process. They secured lodging at the Hotel Europa, a premium establishment favored by foreign investors and diplomats visiting the capital. The luxurious accommodations featured running water, electric lighting, and ornate balconies overlooking the bustling cobblestone streets. For men who had spent years sleeping on the hard dirt while clutching rifles, the soft beds and secure locks offered a profound, novel sense of safety. Establishing a legitimate financial foundation required integrating their stolen American wealth into the Argentine banking system without triggering suspicion. Parker and Longabaugh visited the respected Bank of London and River Plate, presenting themselves as livestock investors seeking to purchase land in the Southern Territories. They deposited thousands of dollars in solid gold coin and authentic bank drafts, opening legitimate accounts under their assumed aliases. The British bank managers welcomed the influx of foreign capital, offering them letters of credit that provided seamless purchasing power across the vast South American Republic. With their finances secured, the men began researching the geographical layout of Patagonia, a sparsely populated region stretching down to the southern tip of the continent. They spent days consulting land agents and studying topographical maps in government offices, searching for a specific type of terrain. They required a location offering abundant fresh water, rich grazing grass for livestock, and extreme punishing isolation from major population centers. The territory of Chubut, nestled against the foothills of the towering Andes Mountains, matched their stringent criteria perfectly. The journey south from Buenos Aires required a transition from luxurious steamships back to the grueling realities of overland travel. They rode the Southern Railway network as far west as the tracks then allowed, reaching the frontier near Cipolletti before continuing beyond the railhead. The landscape had transformed dramatically, the lush green fields of the northern provinces giving way to arid steppes covered in thorny scrub brush. Fierce, relentless winds scoured the plains, carrying sharp grit that stung their faces and coated their clothing in a fine layer of gray dust. In Neuquén, they purchased rugged horses, sturdy pack mules, and a wooden wagon to transport their extensive supplies across the trackless wilderness. The familiar scent of leather saddles and horse sweat provided a comforting return to the physical world they understood best. They hired local guides to navigate the treacherous winding trails leading deep into the interior, crossing swollen rivers and navigating steep, rocky canyons. The journey took weeks of continuous bone-jarring travel, pushing deeper into a frontier devoid of telegraph wires, railroads, or formal law enforcement. The harsh Patagonian landscape bore a striking, comforting resemblance to the rugged terrains of Utah and Wyoming. Towering basalt columns, deep river valleys, and jagged snow-capped peaks formed a formidable natural barrier against the outside world. The sheer scale of the wilderness offered total anonymity, a vast expanse where three armed strangers could disappear without leaving a single trace. Parker felt the residual tension in his shoulders finally release, realizing they had successfully traded the crushing pressure of the American manhunt for the boundless freedom of the Argentine frontier. Entering the Cholula Valley, the outlaws discovered a pristine, fertile basin watered by clear glacial streams flowing down from the towering Andean peaks. Groves of native cypress and arayan trees provided abundant timber for construction and natural shelter against the biting southern winds. Tall, nutritious bunchgrass covered the valley floor, offering ideal grazing conditions for the herds of cattle and sheep they intended to raise. The total population of the surrounding area consisted of only a few dozen isolated Chilean ranchers and Welsh immigrants, ensuring minimal social interference. Utilizing their letters of credit, Parker and Longabaugh purchased 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, officially registering the deed under their established aliases. They transitioned from professional thieves into legitimate property owners, tasked with the immense physical labor required to build a functioning livestock operation from the ground up. They swung steel axes to fell the timber, dragging the logs across the valley using teams of strong draft horses. The repetitive, exhausting manual labor hardened their muscles and blistered their hands, a stark contrast to the easy wealth they had extracted from corporate safes. The men constructed a sturdy 4-room log cabin near a fresh water spring, designing the structure to withstand the brutal Patagonian winters. They sealed the gaps between the logs with mud and built a large stone fireplace to provide constant heat during the frigid nights. The interior featured solid wooden furniture, imported cast iron stoves, and woolen rugs purchased during their time in Buenos Aires. Etta organized the household, transforming the rough timber structure into an exceptionally comfortable, civilized home isolated from the rest of the world. To stock their property, the outlaws purchased 300 head of high-quality cattle, 1,500 sheep, and 28 fine saddle horses from neighboring estancias. They officially registered their own unique livestock brand with the provincial authorities, a legal process Parker found deeply ironic given his extensive background in rustling. The men spent their days in the saddle, driving the herds across the lush valley, branding calves and repairing long stretches of wire fencing. The grueling ranch work demanded total commitment, requiring them to operate in freezing rain and blinding snow to protect their valuable investment. The local inhabitants of the Cholula Valley viewed the wealthy American newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and deep respect. Parker, operating as Santiago Ryan, and Longabaugh projected an aura of quiet strength and exceptional competence, their superior horsemanship and flawless marksmanship earning the admiration of the rugged gauchos. Parker utilized his natural charm to forge friendly relationships with the scattered neighbors, frequently hosting dinners at the cabin and offering assistance during difficult roundups. The community accepted them without question, ignorant of the bounties resting on the heads of the polite, industrious ranchers. A profound sense of peace settled over the log cabin as the years progressed, alien to the chaotic existence the men had left behind. They woke before dawn to the sound of bleating sheep, drinking strong black coffee while watching the sun illuminate the snow-capped peaks of the Andes. The constant fear of ambush, the need to sleep with loaded weapons in hand, and the dread of approaching posses vanished from their daily routine. They had successfully purchased their own amnesty, utilizing stolen funds to construct an impenetrable legal fortress at the edge of the civilized world. Etta adapted flawlessly to the demanding environment, learning to ride astride like a man and mastering the use of a Winchester rifle to protect the herds from predatory pumas. She rode alongside Longabaugh during the long cattle drives, her face tanned by the harsh sun, trading her silk dresses for practical canvas trousers and leather boots. The harsh elements stripped away the refined urban facade she had maintained in New York, revealing a tough, exceptionally capable woman who thrived in the unforgiving wilderness. The partnership between the three residents operated with seamless efficiency, each contributing vital skills to the success of the ranch. The financial returns from their legitimate labor proved substantial, allowing them to expand their land holdings and increase the size of their herds significantly. They sold quantities of wool and beef to regional buyers, generating steady legal income that continuously fortified their bank accounts in Buenos Aires. Parker frequently traveled to the coastal port of Rawson to negotiate supply contracts and purchase advanced agricultural equipment. He walked through the government offices and local banks without fear, conducting honest business transactions while carrying a loaded revolver purely out of ingrained habit. The distance from the United States provided the ultimate security blanket, insulating the Kalila operation from the relentless reach of the Pinkerton agency. Telegraph lines ended hundreds of miles to the north, and mail delivery relied on slow, irregular supply wagons traversing the dangerous dirt trails. News from the outside world arrived months late, filtering through the remote settlements as distorted rumors and outdated newspaper clippings. The outlaws existed in a permanent state of temporal isolation, detached from the rapid industrialization and legal modernization sweeping across North America. During the long winter nights, the trio sat around the blazing stone hearth, reading imported English novels and playing cards in the warm light of kerosene lamps. The howling winds battered the exterior logs, piling snowdrifts high against the windows, but the interior remained a secure, comfortable sanctuary. They rarely spoke of the robberies, the shattered train safes, or the desperate evasions that had funded their current tranquility. The past remained buried beneath thousands of miles of ocean and jagged mountains, a previous lifetime that held no relevance in the quiet valley. The transformation from the most hunted criminals in America to prosperous, respected Argentine ranchers represented a flawless execution of an intricate escape strategy. They had successfully vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a baffled law enforcement apparatus grasping at cold trails and empty hideouts. The bounties remained uncollected, and the Pinkerton files sat dormant, the operatives unable to locate targets that had ceased to exist within their jurisdiction. The Wild Bunch had not been captured, killed, or defeated. They had simply chosen to walk away from the war they had started. Looking out over the vast green expanse of his legal property, Robert LeRoy Parker found the ultimate prize that had eluded him during his entire criminal career. The Kalila Ranch provided true, unshakable autonomy, a life free from the crushing poverty of his youth and the lethal paranoia of his outlaw years. The violent echoes of Wilcox and Winnemucca faded into the absolute silence of the Patagonian frontier, replaced by the lowing of cattle and the rushing water of the mountain streams. The outlaws had achieved the impossible, securing a peaceful, prosperous retirement in a beautiful, isolated valley at the very end of the world. May 1st, 1905. The stagnant chill of the Patagonian autumn settled over the Colilla Valley, shattering the long-standing tranquility. Robert LeRoy Parker stood on the timber porch of his cabin watching a solitary rider approach at a frantic gallop. The figure did not move with the casual rhythm of a gaucho checking boundary fences. This horseman leaned forward, kicking the lathered flanks mercilessly, signaling an emergency that sent a spike of adrenaline straight through Parker's chest. The rider, a Welsh immigrant from the neighboring settlement of Trevelyan, hauled his exhausted mount to a sliding halt in the dirt yard. The horse heaved, white foam dripping from its iron bit, while the messenger gasped for breath. He carried an urgent warning dispatched secretly by Edward Humphreys, a sympathetic local sheriff. Pinkerton detective Frank DeMaio had identified the affluent landowners of Chubut as the wanted fugitives from the United States and provided the information needed for local authorities to act. DeMaio had circulated the Fort Worth photograph and detailed the corporate bounties attached to the American fugitives. Chubut Governor Julio Lezana had issued an arrest warrant placing the provincial authorities in position to move against the Cholila property. The insulating distance of the South American continent, the shield that had guaranteed their safety for years, had finally cracked wide open. Parker gripped the wooden porch rail, the rough bark digging into his calloused palms. Harry Longabaugh and Etta Place emerged from the doorway, their faces hardening into grim masks as they processed the Welshman's report. The prosperous life they built with their bare hands, the thousands of acres of grazing land, the branded cattle, all was instantly forfeited. To remain meant facing an overwhelming military siege, ending only in their deaths or an iron cage. The transition from respected livestock barons back to outlaws occurred in seconds. The trio possessed only a few hours to evacuate the valley before the provincial cavalry arrived to blockade the narrow mountain passes. They moved through the spacious cabin with terrifying efficiency, abandoning the imported furniture, woolen rugs, and luxurious comforts purchased in the capital. Parker dragged canvas saddlebags onto the hardwood floor, prioritizing survival gear, brass ammunition, and the remaining reserves of gold coins. The cold focus of the professional fugitive overrode any emotional attachment. Nostalgia held zero value when armed men approached. Etta strapped a leather gun belt around her waist, sliding a Colt revolver into the holster and grabbing her Winchester repeating rifle. She shed no tear for the abandoned property, her face set in a rigid scowl as she packed winter coats and durable canvas trousers. Longabaugh gathered medical supplies, wrapping bandages and glass bottles of iodine tightly in oilcloth to prevent breakage during the grueling ride ahead. They left the dirty breakfast dishes on the table, a monument to a peaceful morning permanently interrupted. Moving out to the corrals, they selected the 3 strongest horses from their remuda, bypassing the beautiful thoroughbreds for animals possessing deep stamina. They saddled the mounts rapidly, pulling the leather cinch straps brutally tight against the ribs to ensure the gear would not shift during steep ascents. A 4th horse was loaded with packs containing flour, dried beef, and a canvas tent, secured tightly with intricate diamond hitches. The scent of nervous equine sweat and oiled leather replaced the sweet aroma of the blooming Patagonian wildflowers. Without looking back at the log cabin or the grazing cattle, the 3 riders spurred their mounts northward. They avoided established dirt roads, navigating through dense thickets of thorny caliphate bushes that tore viciously at their denim clothing. The sky darkened rapidly, bruised purple clouds rolling over the jagged peaks and unleashing a torrential downpour that soaked them to the bone within minutes. The mud churned beneath the iron horseshoes, slowing their progress and turning the steep ravines into treacherous, slippery traps. The psychological toll of the flight manifested in the unspoken tension radiating between the riders as they pushed their animals relentlessly. Parker mentally calculated the distance to the Chilean border. Knowing the Andean passes offered their only viable escape route, their legitimate bank accounts in Buenos Aires were now inaccessible, frozen by the federal police the moment De Mayo presented the warrants. Surviving the harsh wilderness and securing passage out of the continent required a massive influx of untraceable hard currency. The realization meant a forced return to the profession that exiled them to South America in the first place. The group needed to strike a vulnerable, well-funded target, requiring them to move toward the commercial centers of the central provinces. They remained on the move for months, their supplies dwindling, their clothing repeatedly soaked, their bodies aching from the constant vibration of the saddle. Etta bore the physical hardship stoically, never uttering a word of complaint even as the biting wind cracked her lips and the coarse rains blistered her palms. By December 19th, crossing into the arid plains of San Luis province, the group approached Villa Mercedes, a city enriched by agricultural trade. The settlement featured wide, dusty avenues lined with imposing brick structures, including the regional branch of the Banco de la Nación. Parker and Longabaugh left Etta outside the commercial center, tasked with guarding the pack horse and securing their exit route. The men rode into the district wearing long canvas dusters, pulling their hat brims down to obscure their weathered, bearded faces. They hitched their horses near the bank entrance, observing the foot traffic and noting the presence of 2 armed municipal guards stationed near the corner. Parker scanned the surrounding rooftops and the wide thoroughfare, mapping the trajectory they would take once the alarms inevitably began to ring. Longabaugh checked the smooth mechanical action of his revolvers one final time, feeling the familiar comfort of the oiled steel against his palms. The era of legitimate ranching was officially dead. They were once again standing on the precipice of extreme violence. Pushing through the mahogany doors of the Banco de la Nación, the outlaws stepped into a grand lobby smelling of polished brass and cigar smoke. 6 well-dressed tellers stood behind an ornate iron grill, counting stacks of Argentine pesos and recording deposits for local wheat merchants. Parker drew his weapon with blinding speed, the dark barrel leveling directly at the face of the bank manager seated at a large oak desk. Longabaugh mirrored the action, his voice booming across the quiet room in harsh Spanish, ordering everyone to lie flat on the marble floor. The sudden explosion of action paralyzed the civilians, their faces draining of color as they stared down the bores of the loaded firearms. The bank manager, a stout man wearing a tailored suit, froze in absolute terror, his hands trembling as he raised them toward the ceiling. Parker vaulted over the wooden swinging gate, his boots crashing onto the floorboards, closing the physical distance to the manager in 2 long strides. He grabbed the terrified man by the collar of his expensive jacket, shoving the cold muzzle of the Colt hard against his temple. Parker demanded the keys to the main vault, his voice dropping to a low whisper that conveyed a total willingness to employ lethal force. The manager fumbled inside his vest pocket, retrieving a ring of brass keys and dropping them onto the floor with a loud metallic clatter. Parker scooped them up, dragging the manager toward the rear of the building where the reinforced steel door of the primary safe stood firmly locked. The complex mechanism required both a key and a numerical combination, a defensive layer bypassed through raw physical intimidation. Sweat poured down the manager's forehead, stinging his eyes as his shaking fingers desperately spun the brass dial of the combination lock. The internal tumblers clicked heavily into place, echoing loudly in the tense room until the final pin dropped and the locking bars retracted. Parker hauled the thick steel door open, revealing canvas sacks bulging with national currency, a vast reserve of wealth intended for the regional agricultural conglomerates. He shoved the manager aside, throwing a burlap sack onto the floor and beginning to frantically shovel the bound stacks of paper money inside. Out in the main lobby, Longabaugh maintained a ruthless perimeter, his eyes darting between the terrified hostages and the large glass windows facing the street. A patron attempting to enter the bank noticed the masked man holding the crowd at gunpoint, freezing in shock before turning and sprinting down the boardwalk, screaming for the police. The chaotic shouts from the street signaled the rapid deterioration of their controlled environment, compressing the available time frame for a clean extraction into mere seconds. Longabaugh shouted a sharp warning to his partner, signaling that local authorities were actively responding to the alarm. Parker tied a knot at the top of the burlap sack, hoisted the crushing weight of the stolen pesos onto his broad shoulder, and sprinted back toward the lobby. The haul amounted to roughly 12,000 pesos, a physical burden that slowed his normally rapid movements as he navigated the narrow space behind the teller cages. Bursting back into the public area, he signaled Longabaugh, and the two men began backing toward the entrance, their weapons still firmly trained on the prone hostages. The sack pounded against Parker's ribs with every step, a dangerous anchor. As they pushed through the mahogany doors and stepped onto the exterior boardwalk, two armed municipal policemen rounded the corner, drawing their service revolvers. The lawmen shouted commands in Spanish, raising their weapons and preparing to fire upon the masked thieves emerging from the financial institution. Longabaugh did not hesitate, utilizing his exceptional reflexes to acquire the targets and squeeze the trigger of his Colt in one fluid, continuous motion. The loud, concussive crack of the gunshot shattered the afternoon air, sending a brass projectile smashing into the brick wall inches from the closest policeman's head. The near miss sent the officers diving for cover behind a large wooden water trough, returning frantic, inaccurate fire that shattered the bank's front windows. Shards of jagged glass rained down onto the boardwalk, showering the outlaws as they sprinted toward their tied horses while keeping their heads low. Parker threw the sack of currency across the saddle horn, securing it hastily while bullets snapped through the air, hitting the hitching post with dull, splintering thuds. The horses danced wildly, panicked by the deafening gunshots, forcing the men to wrestle the frightened animals into submission while mounting. Swinging into the saddles, Parker and Longabaugh dug their spurs viciously into the horses' flanks, launching the animals into a dead sprint down the center of the avenue. Armed citizens poured into the street, firing hunting rifles and pistols at the retreating riders, filling the dusty air with gray smoke and the smell of sulfur. A stray bullet grazed the hindquarter of Longabaugh's mount, drawing a thin line of bright red blood. But the superficial wound only spurred the animal to run faster. They ducked low over the mains, utilizing the kicked-up dirt as a visual screen. Breaking past the city limits, they veered sharply off the main road, tearing through the arid brush and heading directly toward the hidden canyon where Etta waited. The relentless sound of the municipal alarm bell faded into the distance, replaced by the harsh, rasping breaths of the exhausted horses. Reaching the rendezvous point, they found Etta already mounted and holding the reins of the pack horse, her rifle resting across her lap, ready for a violent confrontation. Parker nodded sharply, indicating a successful extraction, and the trio turned their horses westward, aiming for the looming silhouette of the Andes. The evasion route demanded a punishing pace, prioritizing sheer distance over the physical well-being of the riders and their mounts. They rode deep into the night, the temperature plummeting as they began the slow, agonizing ascent into the rocky foothills of the massive mountain range. The stolen Argentine pesos provided the necessary capital for their survival, but the currency added a significant, exhausting load to the already burdened animals. The gang spoke very little, conserving their energy and focusing entirely on navigating the treacherous, uneven terrain illuminated only by the faint glow of the stars. By morning, the landscape transformed from arid plains into a hostile vertical world of sheer granite cliffs and deep, shadowed gorges. The air grew noticeably thinner, forcing the horses to stop frequently, their sides heaving violently as they desperately pulled oxygen into their burning lungs. The outlaws dismounted, choosing to lead the animals by the reins along the narrow, crumbling switchbacks to spare them the crushing weight of the riders. One misstep on the loose shale meant a fatal plunge into the bottomless ravines below, requiring absolute, unwavering concentration from every member of the group. The elements unleashed their full fury as the trio pushed higher into the Cordillera, a freezing gale-force wind howling continuously through the narrow stone passes. The wind carried sharp particles of ice that scoured their exposed skin, leaving their faces raw, bloody, and numb to the touch. They wrapped themselves in woolen blankets, but the biting cold penetrated the layers, causing violent shivering that drained their remaining physical reserves. Etta struggled against the punishing conditions, her hands cramping into frozen claws around the leather reins. Yet she continued walking forward without a single word of complaint. Hunger became a constant grinding agony in their stomachs as their hurried departure from Cholula left them with severely limited provisions. They survived on small portions of dried, salted beef and hardtack, chewing the tough rations while walking to keep their internal body temperatures elevated. They melted snow in a small tin cup over tiny smokeless fires fueled by sparse mountain scrub, drinking the lukewarm water to fight off the severe dehydration caused by the altitude. The physical suffering mirrored the worst days of their evasion in Wyoming, a stark reminder that their brief retirement was truly over. The threat of pursuit remained a constant, terrifying shadow hanging over the grueling ascent, forcing Parker to monitor their back trail with brass field glasses. He scanned the lower valleys for any sign of movement, knowing the Argentine rural police possessed expert trackers capable of following their trail deep into the mountains. To counter this threat, they deliberately routed their path across solid rock expanses and through fast-flowing glacial streams, masking the deep hoofprints of their animals. This tactical maneuvering added days to their journey, significantly increasing their exposure to the lethal elements. Crossing the Continental Divide required them to navigate a treacherous, snow-choked pass situated thousands of feet above sea level, a desolate environment devoid of any life. The deep snow drifts buried the trail completely, forcing the men to take turns breaking a path by walking ahead and stomping the frozen crust down for the horses. The exhausting labor in the thin air caused their heads to pound violently, their vision blurring as altitude sickness threatened to incapacitate the entire group. They pushed forward through sheer primal willpower, knowing that stopping to rest in the freezing snow meant certain unavoidable death. Descending the western slope of the mountains, the harsh granite gave way to dense, ancient forests clinging to the steep Chilean valleys. The temperature slowly increased, and the oxygen-rich air filled their starved lungs, providing a surge of renewed energy to the battered fugitives. They had successfully conquered the deadly Cordillera, surviving an environment that routinely killed experienced mountaineers, proving their exceptional resilience once again. However, the victory felt entirely hollow, overshadowed by the permanent loss of the peaceful ranching life they had cultivated in the Cholula Valley. The burlap sack of stolen pesos rested securely on the pack horse, providing the financial means to disappear into the anonymous expanse of South America. Parker, Longabaugh, and Etta Place rode deeper into the Chilean wilderness, entirely stripped of their legitimate identities and branded once more as the most dangerous outlaws on the continent. The Pinkerton net had followed them across the ocean, destroying their sanctuary, and forcing them back into a precarious existence dictated by the barrel of a gun. The era of quiet prosperity had collapsed, leaving nothing behind but the endless, exhausting reality of the fugitive trail. November 4th, 1908. The blistering radiation of the high Andean sun baked the desolate Bolivian altiplano, turning the barren earth into a cracked wasteland. Robert LeRoy Parker and Harry Longabaugh rode their exhausted horses along a treacherous ridge, their faces wrapped in woolen scarves to protect against the searing ultraviolet light and the biting wind. The air at 13,000 feet possessed a razor-thin quality, forcing the riders to draw ragged breaths that burned their lungs and provided minimal oxygen to their starved muscles. The sterile landscape offered no comfort, only an endless ocean of brown rock, deep chasms, and dormant volcanoes piercing the bruised purple sky. The physical deterioration of both men stood in stark contrast to the prosperous ranchers who had governed the Cholula Valley just 3 years prior. Longabaugh suffered from agonizing stomach ailments, his once muscular frame reduced to a hollow shadow of the formidable gunman he had been in the American West. Parker possessed permanent lines etched into his weathered face, his hair turning rapidly gray under the unending stress of a continental manhunt. Etta Place had abandoned the fugitive lifestyle months earlier, returning to the United States and leaving the two partners alone to navigate a hostile nation. Their survival depended on maintaining false identities, operating under the aliases H.A. Brown and Santiago Maxwell, and seeking manual employment within the booming South American mining industry. The pair secured positions guarding payroll shipments for the Concordia tin mine, a strategic move designed to gather vital intelligence. This employment provided them with intimate knowledge of the regional financial logistics, mapping the isolated trails used by burdened couriers to transport corporate currency. The daily proximity to unprotected wealth proved too tempting for the desperate fugitives, reigniting their ingrained predatory instincts. They needed a monumental score to finance a permanent escape from the unrelenting pressure of the law, a haul substantial enough to allow them to vanish into the anonymous crowds of Europe. Their focus shifted toward the Aramayo, Franca and Company, a sprawling mining conglomerate renowned for moving staggering amounts of cash through the remote, unguarded mountain passes. The outlaws spent weeks gathering details regarding the Aramayo schedule, listening to the careless conversations of drunken laborers in the crowded cantinas of Tupiza. They identified Carlos Perot, a trusted company manager, as the primary courier tasked with transporting wages to the sprawling Cuechisla mining camp. Information circulating through the region suggested the approaching shipment would contain 80,000 Bolivian pesos, an absolute fortune capable of securing their total freedom. The magnitude of the anticipated prize blinded Parker and Longabaugh to the severe risks associated with assaulting a prominent corporation in a militarized region. They finalized their ambush strategy, purchasing fresh ammunition and sharpening their hunting knives. The route from Tupiza to Cuechisla traversed some of the most unforgiving topography on the continent, a labyrinth of steep ravines and crumbling shale slopes. Parker selected a specific location for the trap, a winding gorge known to the indigenous population as Huaca Huañusca, translating directly to Dead Cow Hill. The trail constricted severely at this juncture, bordered by sheer rock walls that eliminated any possibility of a lateral escape for the approaching caravan. Jagged boulders littered the floor of the ravine, providing flawless natural cover for the armed men to conceal their mounts. It functioned as an executioner's choke point, a tactical masterpiece designed to force the victims into a state of total vulnerability before the first weapon was ever drawn. The morning of the 4th arrived with a biting frost that coated the rocky ground in a layer of slippery white ice. Parker and Longabaugh positioned themselves behind the boulders before sunrise, their wool ponchos providing meager insulation against the relentless wind howling through the gorge. The physical agony of waiting in the extreme cold tested their endurance, their fingers growing stiff around the cold steel grips. They remained motionless for hours, scanning the distant trail through high-powered binoculars, their breath pluming in white clouds of condensation. The silence of the high Andes felt absolute, broken only by the occasional clatter of falling stones dislodged by the invisible mountain currents. Longabaugh checked the mechanical action of his German-made Mauser rifle, working the bolt to ensure a brass cartridge sat perfectly seated within the firing chamber. The precision weapon offered devastating stopping power at long range, a necessary precaution in the event the courier traveled with a large contingent of armed guards. Parker gripped his trusted Colt revolver, preferring the lethal reliability of the weapon during close-quarters confrontations, his thumb resting heavily on the textured hammer. The familiar weight of the firearms provided a grim reassurance, anchoring the men to the violent reality they had chosen to embrace once more. They functioned as a perfectly synchronized unit, operating on silent, unspoken instincts forged during decades of life or death engagements across 2 continents. Shortly after 9 o'clock, the faint rhythmic sound of clopping hooves and jingling harnesses drifted up the canyon, echoing softly off the towering granite walls. A small caravan materialized through the morning haze, slowly navigating the treacherous incline leading directly into the center of the pre-planned kill zone. Carlos Perot rode at the front of the formation, mounted on a sturdy brown mule and dressed in a thick woolen suit, completely oblivious to the impending danger. Behind him followed his servant Mariano Ramirez and a young indigenous boy tasked with driving the burdened pack animals up the grueling mountain trail. The outlaws watched with predatory focus, their eyes locking onto a specific gray mule carrying 2 bulging leather saddlebags. Secured tightly with hemp ropes, the steepness of Huaxahuañusca forced the animals to slow to an agonizing crawl, their hooves slipping on the loose stones, their sides heaving with exhaustion. Perot focused entirely on navigating the dangerous path, his attention directed downward at the uneven ground rather than scanning the elevated rock formations flanking his position. The outlaws waited until the caravan reached the most constricted segment of the ravine, allowing the riders to enter the absolute center of the trap. The element of surprise remained the most potent weapon in their arsenal, a tactical advantage that would paralyze the victims and prevent organized resistance. Parker nodded silently to Longabaugh, signaling the initiation of the assault, and the 2 men stepped out from behind the boulders, their weapons leveled and ready. Longabaugh barked a harsh command in accented Spanish, ordering the riders to halt and raise their hands toward the bright blue sky. Perot jerked his head upward, his eyes widening in pure shock as he stared down the dark bore of the Mauser rifle pointed directly at his chest. The servant Ramirez gasped loudly, pulling tight on his reins and causing his mule to dance nervously on the narrow, unstable trail. The young boy froze completely, dropping his driving stick and cowering behind the pack animals, terrified by the sudden appearance of the armed foreigners. The loud, metallic click of Parker cocking his revolver shattered any illusions of safety, confirming the lethal intentions of the men blocking the path. The courier processed the grim reality of the situation rapidly, his mind assessing the heavily armed men and recognizing the futility of drawing his own weapon. The outlaws possessed the high ground, superior firepower, and a clear willingness to pull their triggers, leaving Perot with 0 tactical options for defense. He slowly raised his gloved hands, his voice trembling slightly as he pleaded with the bandits to spare their lives, promising total cooperation. Parker stepped forward, keeping his revolver aimed squarely at the manager's face, his eyes cold and unblinking, projecting an aura of ruthless dominance. The capitulation of the victims ensured a bloodless transfer of assets, adhering to the core operational philosophy the duo had perfected years earlier. Parker ordered Ramirez to dismount slowly, instructing the terrified servant to unfasten the thick ropes securing the leather saddlebags to the gray pack mule. The servant's hands shook violently as he fumbled with the complex knots, his fingers slipping against the rough hemp under the glaring scrutiny of the armed robbers. The bags hit the rocky ground with a dense thud, the metallic clinking of thousands of silver coins echoing off the canyon walls. Longabaugh maintained his lethal overwatch, his rifle tracking the subtle movements of the captives, ready to unleash devastating force if anyone attempted a desperate act of heroism. The physical transfer of the corporate wealth required only minutes, a rapid, efficient extraction executed with chilling professional precision. While Ramirez wrestled with the load, Parker conducted a thorough physical search of the captives, stripping them of any potential defensive tools. He reached inside Perro's wool coat, retrieving a small Browning semi-automatic pistol from a hidden shoulder holster, tossing the weapon safely out of reach. He also confiscated an engraved silver pocket watch, noting the intricate craftsmanship before slipping the valuable timepiece into his own canvas pocket. The meticulous disarmament guaranteed the outlaws a safe, uncontested retreat, preventing the courier from mounting any form of aggressive retaliation once their backs were turned. The victims stood shivering in the freezing wind, stripped of their possessions and their dignity, entirely at the mercy of the foreign bandits. With the area secured, Parker turned his attention to the saddlebags, drawing his hunting knife and slicing through the thick canvas seals securing the currency. He reached inside, pulling out a wrapped bundle and tearing the paper away to reveal the shining, newly minted silver coins of the Bolivian Republic. A crushing wave of disappointment washed over the outlaw as he rapidly calculated the volume of the stolen wealth resting in the dirt. The haul amounted to roughly 15,000 Bolivian pesos, a sum worth approximately 90,000 American dollars in modern terms. It represented a staggering fortune for a common laborer, but fell vastly short of the amount the robbers expected to seize from the company courier. The 80,000 peso shipment had not traveled with Perot's party, leaving the men with only a fraction of the intended reward after committing a highly visible, incredibly dangerous felony. The realization that they had risked their lives and guaranteed a military pursuit for the smaller payroll fueled a bitter frustration within Parker. They had exposed their identities and alerted the powerful mining conglomerates, painting glowing targets on their own backs for a severely diminished payoff. The harsh reality of the frontier had struck again, demonstrating that reliable intelligence remained a scarce commodity, and rumors often led to catastrophic miscalculations. Despite the crushing disappointment, the men masked their emotions, maintaining their cold, professional demeanor in front of the terrified captives. The outlaws forced Ramirez to lift the saddlebags and secure them tightly across the back of their own pack animal, ensuring the load remained perfectly balanced. The sheer weight of the silver coins caused the horse to grunt in protest, its knees buckling slightly under the localized strain. Longabaugh ordered the courier and his servants to continue walking up the steep trail toward Queshisla, strictly forbidding them from turning around or attempting to follow the robbers. The captives obeyed without hesitation, spurring their mules forward and hurrying away from the kill zone, desperate to put distance between themselves and the lethal foreigners. The outlaws watched them disappear over the rocky ridge, waiting until the sound of hooves faded completely before initiating their own rapid descent. Turning their horses around, Parker and Longabaugh spurred their mounts hard, navigating the treacherous, crumbling switchbacks with a reckless speed. The physical burden of the stolen silver coins significantly hindered their progress, the dense weight slowing their animals on the steep, ascending grades of the Andean passes. They pushed the exhausted horses to the limits of their endurance, knowing the survival window before the authorities mobilized was closing with terrifying velocity. The freezing wind whipped tears from their eyes, blurring their vision as they tore through the desolate landscape, seeking the safety of the remote, unmapped valleys. The robbery at Huaxahuañusca marked the point of no return. severing any remaining ties to legitimate society and confirming their status as active targets. Carlos Perot pushed his mule to the point of collapse, reaching a small, remote mining camp several hours after the devastating ambush in the ravine. He burst into the manager's office, breathless and exhausted, shouting the details of the robbery and demanding access to the company's communication equipment. The frantic courier provided accurate, detailed physical descriptions of the two foreign bandits, noting their distinct North American accents, their Mauser rifles, and their exceptionally calm demeanor. The alarm spread with astonishing speed, shattering the quiet routine of the high-altitude settlements and triggering a massive, coordinated response from the regional authorities. The Aramayo Company possessed immense political influence, and their executives demanded swift, brutal justice for the brazen theft of their corporate payroll. The telegraph network, a modern technological marvel stretching across the rugged Bolivian landscape, proved to be the outlaw's most formidable and effective adversary. The copper wires hummed with frantic energy as the mining executives transmitted the physical descriptions of Parker and Longabaugh to police garrisons and military outposts across the southern departments. Authorities in the bustling railway hub of Uyuni and the commercial center of Tupiza received the alerts simultaneously, rapidly organizing heavily armed posses to intercept the fleeing foreigners. The insulating distance of the Andes, previously considered an impenetrable shield, dissolved entirely under the lightning-fast transmission of electronic data. The outlaws were riding blindly into a closing net, unaware that the entire nation was rapidly mobilizing to hunt them down. The outlaws made a catastrophic, fundamental error during their chaotic escape, a tactical mistake that provided the Bolivian authorities with a highly visible, easily trackable trail. In their haste to secure the funds and flee the scene, they had stolen a specific pack mule belonging to the Aramayo, Frank and Company to help carry the heavy silver. This particular animal bore the large, unmistakable registered brand of the mining conglomerate burned deeply into its left flank, serving as a glaring beacon to anyone who crossed their path. They paraded this stolen, identifiable property through remote indigenous villages and scattered mining camps, unknowingly broadcasting their exact location to dozens of potential informants. The stolen mule transformed their quiet evasion into a publicized parade, guaranteeing their swift discovery by the pursuing posses. The Bolivian military response demonstrated a level of speed and lethal efficiency that vastly exceeded the capabilities of the rural American sheriffs the outlaws had previously encountered. Regiments of seasoned cavalry soldiers, veterans of brutal border conflicts, saddled their mounts and loaded their high-powered rifles, eager to claim the corporate bounties. These soldiers possessed intimate knowledge of the unforgiving terrain, accustomed to operating in the oxygen-starved altitudes and navigating the treacherous, unmarked mountain passes. They recruited skilled indigenous trackers, men who could read the subtle disturbances in the frozen dirt and follow the deep, dragging hoofprints of heavily laden pack animals. The pursuit force represented a relentless, mechanized instrument of state violence, perfectly adapted to the harsh Andean environment. As Parker and Longabaugh pushed deeper into the desolate wilderness, the psychological weight of the renewed chase began to crush their remaining resolve. The constant, draining paranoia returned with terrifying force, forcing them to scan the jagged horizon incessantly, jumping at every shadow and the sound of falling rocks. The bags of silver coins, the very object of their desperate gamble, felt less like a ticket to freedom and more like a dense, inescapable anchor dragging them toward their doom. By the evening of November 6th, the outlaws reached the outer edges of an incredibly remote, impoverished mining settlement known as San Vicente, seeking shelter from the rapidly dropping temperatures. The village consisted of a few dozen dilapidated adobe structures clinging stubbornly to a barren hillside, inhabited by impoverished miners extracting meager amounts of silver and antimony from the frozen earth. The isolation of the location offered a deceptive illusion of safety, a seemingly perfect hiding spot to rest their exhausted bodies and tend to their starving animals. They rode slowly into the central dirt plaza, their dusters coated in white salt, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. They approached a small mud-brick boarding house owned by a local resident, requesting a room for the night and offering to pay handsomely in solid silver coin. The proprietor, noticing the weapons, the foreign accents, and the severely exhausted condition of the men, accepted the payment with a deeply suspicious, lingering stare. He directed them to a small, dark room at the rear of the structure, providing a meager plate of boiled potatoes and tough llama meat. The outlaws unsaddled their horses, dragging the leather bags of currency into the cramped, windowless room, barricading the stout wooden door behind them. The proprietor walked out to the small corral to inspect the animals left by the mysterious strangers, his eyes locking onto the flank of the exhausted pack mule. The large burned brand of the Aramayo Company stood out clearly against the animal's dusty coat, a glaring confirmation of the violent robbery detailed on the telegraph wires. The local man understood the danger of harboring violent fugitives, possessing a deep fear of the military reprisal that would surely follow if he failed to report their presence. He quietly slipped away from the boarding house, sprinting through the freezing night toward the small fortified headquarters of the local police detachment, springing the lethal trap that had been closing around them for 3 days. November 6, 1908. The freezing shadows lengthened across the dirt plaza of San Vicente, a desolate Bolivian mining camp at 14,000 feet. The sun dropped behind jagged western peaks, plunging the settlement into a biting cold that froze mud in the narrow streets. Soldiers from the Abaroa Regiment moved with silent precision through the alleyways, their boots making minimal noise. Captain Justo Concha directed the small detachment and local authorities with concise hand signals, forming a perimeter around a dilapidated mud-brick boarding house. The stolen Aramayo pack mule had led them to this courtyard, verifying the presence of the payroll robbers resting inside. Inside the windowless room at the rear of the property, Robert LeRoy Parker and Harry Longabaugh prepared a simple evening meal. They sat on wooden stools, chewing tough salted meat while stolen silver coins rested in canvas sacks near the timber door. Exhaustion from their grueling ascent through the Cordillera weighed on their bones, dulling their sharp senses and slowing reaction times. The thick adobe walls provided insulation against the freezing wind, but also blocked the sounds of soldiers taking positions outside. For the first time, the seasoned outlaws had allowed themselves to become surrounded without perceiving the incoming threat. Captain Concha possessed clear orders from the regional governor to capture or neutralize the men responsible for the Huaca Huañusca payroll robbery. He deployed skilled marksmen on the flat rooftops of adjacent structures, giving them unobstructed lines of sight into the central courtyard. Remaining soldiers formed a semicircle near the main entrance, resting their Mauser rifles on low stone walls for maximum firing stability. Concha understood the lethal reputation of the trapped men and refused to order a frontal assault that would result in unacceptable casualties. He opted for a cautious approach, aiming to draw the fugitives into the open where superior numbers would dictate the outcome. Concha summoned Inspector Timoteo Rios, a local police official familiar with the settlement, instructing him to initiate contact with the suspects. Rios requested a volunteer from the military ranks to accompany him into the courtyard, needing a second armed man to provide cover during the dangerous approach. A seasoned soldier named Victor Torres stepped forward, gripping his rifle tightly and nodding readiness while checking his brass cartridges. The two men walked slowly toward the arched entrance of the boarding house, their boots crunching softly on the frozen gravel. The tension in the cold air thickened rapidly as Rios and Torres crossed the threshold into the exposed patio. Longabaugh heard the faint crunch of footsteps approaching their rented room, his ingrained survival instincts finally piercing through the fog of exhaustion. He stood up from the stool swiftly, drawing his Colt revolver from its leather holster in one fluid, practiced motion honed over decades. He moved toward the open doorway, stepping onto the freezing dirt of the courtyard to investigate the noise, his eyes scanning the dark shadows. He spotted the silhouettes of two men advancing toward him, their rifles held ready, verifying the arrival of local authorities. The years of evasion culminated in this tense confrontation under the freezing Bolivian stars. Torres raised his Mauser rifle, aiming the long steel barrel at the silhouette emerging from the dark doorway, preparing to fire a warning shot. Longabaugh reacted with the lethal speed that had defined his reputation across the American West, leveling his Colt and squeezing the trigger without hesitation. The loud, concussive blast of the revolver shattered the quiet evening, sending a brass projectile tearing through the cold air at high velocity. The metal struck Torres squarely in the neck, severing a major artery and sending a spray of bright blood across the dirt floor. The soldier collapsed instantly, dropping his weapon and falling backward into the shadows, dead before his body hit the ground. Inspector Rios scrambled backward in sheer terror, diving for cover behind a thick wooden pillar as Longabaugh fired a second shot that splintered the timber. The death of the soldier eliminated any possibility of a peaceful resolution, igniting a ferocious firefight between the trapped outlaws and the surrounding detachment. Captain Concha bellowed a harsh command, and the armed men opened fire, unleashing a devastating volley of high-velocity projectiles into the small courtyard. The deafening roar of the rifles echoed through the narrow valley, tearing the quiet night apart with raw, explosive violence and blinding muzzle flashes. Longabaugh retreated rapidly into the windowless room, diving onto the dirt floor as the military barrage chewed into the exterior of the mud brick structure. Copper-jacketed projectiles slammed into the thick adobe, ripping large chunks of dried mud and straw from the walls and sending sharp debris flying. Parker dropped to the ground beside his partner, drawing his own weapons and crawling toward a narrow opening near the heavy, splintering wooden door. The outlaws found themselves trapped inside a confined space, facing a concentration of firepower with no alternative exit and severely limited reserves of brass ammunition. The soldiers maintained a continuous punishing rate of fire, their weapons flashing brightly in the darkness and illuminating the courtyard with strobe-like bursts of light. High-powered rounds punched through thinner sections of the mud brick walls, creating jagged holes that exposed the interior of the room to the freezing wind. Pulverized dirt filled the air, depriving them of clean oxygen and coating their clothes in a thick layer of brown powder as they scrambled to avoid incoming fire. Parker braced his revolver against the doorframe, returning calculated suppressive shots toward the muzzle flashes on the adjacent rooftops, attempting to disrupt the military marksmen. The exchange of gunfire raged for hours, the intense noise causing a painful ringing in the ears of the trapped men inside the small room. Every time Parker or Longabaugh attempted to return fire, several rifles focused directly on their position, driving them back down into the cold dirt. The interior of the room deteriorated rapidly under the barrage, wooden furniture splintering into sharp fragments and the clay water jug shattering into muddy paste. The stolen canvas sacks of silver coins sat uselessly in the corner, a mocking reminder of the hollow prize that had lured them into this inescapable trap. The fortune provided absolutely no physical protection against the relentless barrage of military steel. The temperature plummeted drastically as midnight approached, the freezing cold numbing the fingers of the outlaws and slowing their ability to reload their weapons. They possessed only the ammunition carried on their heavy leather gun belts, having left reserve cartridges securely packed in saddlebags attached to their horses. Parker counted his remaining brass shells in the darkness, feeling the cold, smooth metal and calculating the grim reality of their rapidly dwindling defensive supplies. The soldiers outside possessed large wooden crates of military reserves, allowing them to maintain the punishing siege indefinitely until the fugitives exhausted their ability to shoot back. A sudden, concentrated burst of rifle fire targeted the thick wooden door, the projectiles tearing through the planks and transforming the barrier into jagged splinters. One high-velocity round pierced the wood and struck Longabaugh in the left arm, shattering the bone and sending an agonizing shockwave through his body. He grunted heavily in pain, dropping his revolver into the dirt as warm blood poured freely from the jagged exit wound, soaking his sleeve. The physical trauma severely compromised their defensive posture, reducing their returning fire by half and emboldening the soldiers to press their tactical advantage from the perimeter. Parker ripped a long strip of fabric from his own shirt, tying a tight tourniquet above Longabaugh's bleeding bicep to slow the dangerous arterial blood loss. The makeshift bandage provided minimal relief, the intense physical pain causing Longabaugh to grit his teeth and draw shallow, ragged breaths in the freezing air. He retrieved his weapon from the mud with his right hand, determined to continue fighting despite the crippling injury. His legendary stubbornness refusing to yield. The two men huddled together in the darkest corner of the ruined room, their backs pressed against the crumbling adobe, surrounded by the deafening impacts of incoming fire. The Bolivian commander ordered his men to adjust their firing angles, directing a deadly crossfire through the newly created holes in the walls to eliminate safe zones. Intersecting trajectories created a lethal grid of flying metal inside the room, making any movement exceptionally hazardous for the trapped, exhausted outlaws trying to survive. A second projectile found its mark, striking Longabaugh squarely in the torso, penetrating his canvas coat and tearing through his abdomen with devastating, unstoppable force. He collapsed heavily onto the muddy floor, his body curling inward as the severe internal damage sent him into a state of deep, agonizing shock. Parker dragged his severely wounded partner deeper into the corner, his hands slick with bright red blood pooling rapidly on the packed earth of the floor. Dim moonlight filtering through the shattered door revealed the catastrophic extent of the injury, confirming that Longabaugh would not survive the freezing, violent night. The rugged gunman who had outdrawn rural sheriffs and outrun corporate detectives across 2 continents now lay dying on the floor of a foreign mining camp. The stark reality of their situation settled heavily onto Parker's shoulders, bringing a cold, grim clarity to the final, bloody moments of their long partnership. The military firing slowed to a sporadic, methodical rhythm, soldiers conserving their brass cartridges while maintaining the absolute lockdown on the perimeter of the courtyard. Captain Concha understood the fugitives were trapped and badly wounded, choosing to let the freezing temperatures and extreme blood loss finish the work without risking further casualties. The silence between the gunshots felt heavy and oppressive, filled only by the harsh, wet rasping of Longabaugh struggling to pull cold oxygen into his failing lungs. Parker sat quietly beside him, holding his Colt revolver steadily, knowing that any attempt to surrender would result in a brutal execution or a slow death in prison. Under the sequence later proposed in the local police report, and assuming the dead men were Parker and Longabaugh, the final minutes unfolded as a desperate refusal to be taken alive. The prospect of facing a hangman's noose or rotting in a damp stone cell had always terrified them more than the finality of a swift brass projectile. Longabaugh looked up at Parker, his eyes clouded with intense physical pain and exhaustion, giving a faint, subtle nod that communicated his final request. The unspoken understanding required a horrific act of loyalty, a devastating burden placed upon the man who had led the criminal syndicate for over a decade. Parker checked the cylinder of his revolver, feeling the cold brass rims of the remaining cartridges, confirming he possessed enough ammunition to complete the grim task. He looked around the ruined adobe room, taking in the splintered wood, the shattered clay jug, and the useless bags of stolen silver resting in the mud. The vast fortune they had stolen from the Aramayo company meant nothing now, reduced to heavy, shiny metal that could not purchase a single drop of water. The grand, sprawling adventure that began in the canyons of Utah had violently contracted into this tiny, freezing box of dirt at the top of the world. He raised the heavy Colt, pointing the steel barrel toward his dying partner, his hand remaining perfectly steady despite the freezing cold and the immense weight. He aimed carefully, ensuring the shot would deliver a swift, painless conclusion to the physical agony ravaging Longabaw's failing, battered body on the dirt floor. The sharp crack of the revolver sounded distinctly different from the heavy boom of the military rifles echoing briefly within the confined space before fading into the wind. Longabaw's body went completely still, the tension leaving his muscles as the lethal projectile ended his suffering and severed his ties to the violent world. Parker sat alone in the darkness, the last surviving member of the leadership that had terrorized the corporate monopolies of the North American continent for years. The silence in the room grew absolute, pressing inward against his eardrums, isolating him completely from the armed men waiting patiently outside the crumbling mud walls. The freezing wind whistled through the jagged bullet holes, chilling his skin and numbing his tired muscles as the blood dried on his calloused hands. He possessed no desire to face the Bolivian soldiers, no intention of facing a foreign tribunal, and zero will to continue the endless, exhausting flight alone. He slowly loaded a single fresh cartridge into the cylinder of his weapon, rotating the steel mechanism until the round aligned perfectly with the firing pin. He raised the heavy revolver once more, placing the cold steel barrel firmly against his own temple, feeling the sharp chill of the metal contrasting against his skin. His mind focused entirely on the grim physical reality of his present situation inside the shattered boarding house room, accepting the finality of his brutal decision. The era of the wild frontier had officially closed, leaving no sanctuary, no hidden valleys, and no future for a man unwilling to surrender his freedom. The final gunshot rang out from the interior of the boarding house, a solitary, definitive sound that signaled the absolute termination of the long, bloody standoff. The Bolivian soldiers surrounding the courtyard tightened their grips on their rifles, anticipating a desperate final charge from the trapped fugitives they believed were still fighting. They waited in tense silence for several minutes, their eyes straining through the darkness to detect any movement within the shattered doorway of the small adobe room. When no further sounds emerged from the structure, Captain Concha ordered his men to hold their positions, refusing to authorize an entry until the sun rose. The freezing night slowly transitioned into a pale gray dawn, the early morning light revealing the extensive damage inflicted upon the small adobe building during the siege. The exterior walls were pockmarked with hundreds of deep bullet holes, the dried mud crumbling into piles of fine dust on the frozen ground of the courtyard. The soldiers stood down from their firing stances, their breath visible in the frigid morning air, their weapons still aimed cautiously at the dark entrance of the room. Captain Concha drew his service pistol and gestured for a small squad to accompany him, moving slowly across the blood-stained dirt of the central patio. They stepped carefully over the frozen body of Victor Torres, the fallen soldier serving as a grim testament to the lethal accuracy of the foreign bandits. Concha approached the ruined wooden door, kicking the splintered planks aside and peering into the dim, dusty interior of the rented room with his pistol raised. The smell of copper, burnt black powder, and death hung heavily in the stagnant air, assaulting the senses of the soldiers as they crossed the threshold. The scene inside confirmed the brutal final resolution of the siege, presenting a tableau of extreme violence and desperate, unwavering resolve on the dirt floor. The two fugitives lay dead on the muddy floor, their bodies positioned close together in the darkest corner of the cramped, completely ruined adobe space. The soldiers secured the room, kicking the discarded weapons away from the lifeless hands and verifying that no further threat remained from the men on the ground. Both bodies carried wounds from the fight, while one man had a close-range bullet wound in the forehead and the other a wound through the temple. The local report interpreted the positions and injuries as evidence that one badly wounded robber had been killed by his companion, who then turned the revolver on himself. But the precise sequence could not be proved. The soldiers discovered the heavy canvas sacks resting in the corner, tearing them open to reveal the massive stash of newly minted Bolivian silver coins. The recovery of the Aramayo payroll provided undeniable proof that the deceased men were the perpetrators of the Huatzahhuañusca ambush detailed on the telegraph wires. Concha ordered his men to carry the bodies out into the bright morning sunlight, laying them onto the frozen dirt of the plaza for official documentation. The local villagers emerged from their homes, gathering around the perimeter to stare silently at the faces of the notorious foreigners who had brought a war to their settlement. The regional authorities conducted a thorough search of the dead men's possessions, seeking any documents or items that could verify their true identities or origins. They found no passports, no letters, and no official papers, only the stolen silver watch, spare brass ammunition, and a few minor personal effects. Later correspondents connected the unknown men with the aliases Frank Boyd or H.A. Brown and Santiago Maxwell, names used by foreign miners in the region. Bolivian officials never established that the bodies belonged to Robert LeRoy Parker and Harry Longabaugh, leaving the famous identification dependent on circumstantial evidence assembled afterward. Lacking formal identification or family contacts, the local authorities ordered a rapid, unceremonious burial of the remains. The bodies were taken to the rocky soil of the San Vicente Cemetery, a desolate patch of ground surrounded by barren, wind-scoured hills. They were buried without permanent markers identifying the men resting below, leaving later investigators unable to locate remains that could be conclusively matched to the American fugitives. The hard dirt closed over two unknown robbers, preserving the uncertainty that would surround the San Vicente deaths for generations. The news of the shootout and the recovery of the stolen payroll spread across the telegraph wires, reaching the Aramayo executives and eventually filtering northward. Investigations by diplomats, detectives, and historians later compared the physical descriptions, aliases, weapons, and timeline of events in San Vicente with the known movements of Cassidy and Longabaugh. The circumstantial evidence strongly linked the dead men to the elusive leaders of the Wild Bunch, but no contemporary witness positively identified either body by a legal name. The manhunt faded as authorities accepted the likely conclusion, while the unresolved identification kept the case from ever closing with absolute certainty. The violent conclusion in the Bolivian mining camp provided a brutal ending to the documented trail of the two fugitives pursued across two continents. The apparent decision of one man to kill his wounded companion and then himself rather than surrender reinforced the legend of uncompromising defiance, even as the identities beneath the gunshot wounds remained unproven. The unmarked graves in San Vicente preserved that uncertainty, while the robberies and evasions ensured a permanent place in frontier folklore for the men believed to have died there. The harsh wind of the Altiplano blew across the dirt cemetery, erasing the final physical traces of two unknown outlaws whose story had already traveled far beyond the isolated settlement.